Israel, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone joining us from abroad. Welcome to Nishmat, the Jeannie Schottenstein Center for Advanced Torah Study for Women, and to our annual Mali Sherman Pesach Yom Iyun. Today, you will have the pleasure of hearing from Rabbanit Naima Novetsky, from Rabbanit Navi Tzaddik, who is the head of our Elisa Flato program and our online Beit Midrash and summer program, and from Rav David Sperling, our Rosh Beit Midrash. In addition to all the learning we'll do today, we encourage you to go online to nishmat.net and check out our ongoing online programs, which you can register for. And we encourage you to join us here live in Jerusalem this summer for our summer program as it returns July 7th to July 21st. We hope to see you then. Before we begin the learning, I want to say a word about Mali Sherman. Mali Sherman was a student in Nishmat's very first days. She was a lover of Torah, she was a lover of learning, and she took everything she learned here and brought it back to her home, into her family, and transformed the generations of her family and their future. From the time of her passing, we've had the honor of her children, Moshe, Lainey, and Sorrel, sponsoring this Yom Iyun in her memory. And we've had the honor and the pleasure of her granddaughters learning at Nishmat and the many generations of her family being part of the Nishmat family. So we are pleased to continue to mark her memory, and we hope you enjoy this morning of learning. Thank you for joining us. Pesach Kasher V'Sameach from here in Yerushalayim.
Hi, welcome everybody. Over the next hour, as Pesach approaches, I wanted to discuss one of the most fundamental questions that I think lies at the heart of the entire holiday. And that is, why was Shibud Mitzrayim? Why was the exile and oppression necessary? On Leil HaSeder, we spend an awful lot of time talking about the nature of the bondage. And we spend a lot of time thanking Hashem and saying Hallel for taking us out of Egypt. One thing, though, that we don't discuss on Leil HaSeder is, why did Hashem put us there to begin with? What purpose did the bondage serve? Why is it part of Hashem's divine plan for our nation? Usually in Tanakh, when we see suffering on a large scale, such as exile or subjugation, it's often explained in terms of sin and punishment. So, for example, if you think about the plagues after Chet HaEgel, this is obvious that there's a crime and there was retribution for that crime. The 40 years in the desert is obviously a punishment for the sin of the spies. When the 10 tribes are exiled, there's an entire chapter in Sefer Melachim, which is devoted to explaining what were the causes of that exile. What were the sins that Bnei Israel did to deserve it? The Churban, the destruction of Beit HaMikdash, similarly, if you look through Nevi'im, you hear all over the place. This was because of X, Y, and Z sin. However, if you look throughout Sefer Shmot, you'll be hard-pressed to find a sin that Bnei Israel committed. And even if you find a sin that they committed, one that is on a scale to justify the suffering of the exile and bondage in Egypt, is going to be very hard to find. So what could possibly be the reason that Bnei Israel were meant to be in exile and oppressed? If we turn to the covenant between the pieces, the original place where Hashem decreed the exile and the slavery, we'll have another set of questions that bear on our larger question of, why was the bondage necessary? I'm going to share my screen and we'll look at those psukim inside. So in Sefer Breshit, in Parak Kedva, in chapter 15 of Sefer Breshit, Hashem already decrees to Abraham that in the future, his children will be both exiled and oppressed. Vayomer LaAvraham, Yadoa Tida ki ger yeh zar'acha be'eretz lo lahem. Hashem tells Abraham, know well that your offspring will be foreigners in a land not theirs. Va'avadum v'inu otam 400 shana, and they will enslave them and afflict them for 400 years. But also the nation whom they will serve, I will judge. And afterwards, they will come out with great wealth. So here Hashem already decrees to Abraham that his descendants will be in exile, will be enslaved. And we wonder, Why does Hashem share this prophecy with Avraham Avinu? This is 2 generations before the event is going to happen, right? About 2 centuries before the actual oppression and enslavement in Egypt. Why was it necessary to share with Abraham such depressing, terrifying news? And if we look at the decree, we see that the prophecy is actually made up of 2 distinct decrees. One of exile, Ger Yezaracha, and one of oppression, Ba'avadum v'inu otam. They'll be enslaved and they'll be afflicted. And these different decrees actually affected different people. The children of Yaakov are the ones who went into exile, but they didn't actually suffer from the bondage itself. When they were living in Egypt, they were having actually pretty decent conditions with Yosef. It's only afterwards, a different generation that's actually going to be the ones that are oppressed. So when one thinks about the causes of the exile and bondage, one also has to recognize that we have different time periods. We have Abraham's generation, who was foretold of the event. We have his grandchildren, the tribes, who went down to Egypt and were actually exiled. And then we have a 3rd generation, the next generation, which is the ones that are oppressed. And one has to wonder, which one of these generations should we be thinking about in terms of who was this for, why was this for, what was the purpose of it, etc. Commentators pondered these questions, and in exploring the issue, they often draw on their own experiences in exile, using the oppression in Egypt as a prism through which to understand the suffering of their own time. They ask not just why was the bondage in Egypt necessary, but they ask why the whole door omdim aleinu lechalotinu, that line that we say in the Haggadah, why in every generation do they stand up and try to destroy us? Why is it that in every generation, Am Yisrael is singled out for persecution? And I think that when we explore this question and when our commentators explore this question, trying to understand the purposes of the bondage, but also the purposes of persecution throughout history, commentators often do 2 things, and I don't know if it's necessarily consciously or not. They often really are asking that more general question of Sadiq Viralo, the question of theodicy. Why are there sometimes righteous people and nonetheless bad happens to them? And I think the approaches that people take for our specific question of why was the bondage in Egypt necessary are to some extent the same types of approaches that people give to the more general question of Sadiq Viralo, which there are many, but 2 that are often proposed is to question, when we say Sadiq Viralo, why is a righteous person suffering? So some people suggest, well, maybe the Sadiq's not a Sadiq. Maybe you think the person is righteous, but actually there was a hidden sin that you didn't know, and that's why he deserved his suffering. Here too, by us, some people are going to take that approach, say we deserved it. Somehow, even though we don't have an explicit sin anywhere written in Sefer Shemot, maybe we can find some sin that justifies the suffering. Other people question the second half of that phrase, not the tzaddik part, the viralo. Maybe sometimes our perceptions of bad are misconstrued. Maybe when we say tzaddik viralo, what we think was for the negative somehow was nonetheless. And here too, in Shiabud Mitzrayim, and the question that we're going to be asking as far as of Pesach and the oppression, people also question, yes, obviously there was suffering and there was exile and there was, lots and lots of pain, but maybe it wasn't viralo. Somehow instead, it was litovo. Somehow this was for Am Yisrael, for either the formation of the nation, some instilling of beliefs and values, some type of educative, some type of more positive slant on it, that the suffering was necessary in order to get to some improvement in who we are as a nation. I think there's one other thing that commentators take to the table, again, maybe subconsciously, and that's a question of what if. If we're thinking about why was the enslavement a necessary part of Am Yisrael's history, one way of thinking about it is to question, well, what if it didn't happen? What if there had never been an enslavement and never been a redemption from that enslavement, how if it wasn't part of us? And if you think about how many things we do as Jews that relate somehow to the Egyptian bondage. How many mitzvot are connected to it? How many holidays are connected to it? And how would Am Yisrael be different if that just wasn't part of our national history? Okay, so take a second for yourselves actually just to think about that. And I'm going to check the chat. I see that some people are in. Okay, so if people's video sound is still bad, just let me know. I'll bring my computer closer. Maybe that'll make a difference. Okay. So let's delve into our impression and see how do they answer these questions. We're going to start with that general approach that says maybe they deserved it. Maybe somehow this was a punishment for sin. And of course, then the question is, whose sin, what sin, and why was it justified? We're going to start in the Gemara. In Talmud Bavli, a few different rabbis discuss our question, and we're going to look at two of the opinions brought. Amar Rabbi Abahu, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Mipnei ma ne'enash Avraham Avinu v'nishtabdu banav leMitzrayim 210 shani. So Rabbi Abahu, in the name of Rabbi Elazar, asks, why was Avraham punished and his children enslaved for 210 years? Okay, so already just note in his question, he's assuming that, first of all, this is a punishment. Second of all, that this is a punishment specifically for Avraham. Okay, so Shmuel answers and he says, because he examined the characteristics of the Holy One, blessed be he, meaning he questioned Hashem's midot, he questioned Hashem's way of running the world, and he says, where did he question? Because he questioned and said, how should I know that I shall inherit it? Referring to inheriting the land. Okay, we'll start with this approach and then we'll look at the second approach in a second. Okay, so when did Avram ask this? So when Hashem promised him Eretz Yisrael in chapter 15 of Sefer Breshit, I take that back. The land, Abraham asked, how do I know that I will inherit it? So the question that we have to ask is, what's the problem about this? So what Shmuel seems to be suggesting is that this shows some type of a lack of faith. Avram shouldn't have questioned Hashem by saying, how do I know that I will inherit it? And what Shmuel might be suggesting is, and if Avram's going to question it, well, then what is a measure for measure punishment? Questioning, how will I get Eretz Yisrael? So Hashem answers him, oh, if you question whether you're going to get Eretz Yisrael, actually you won't get Eretz Yisrael right away. Your children are going to have to wait 400 years in order to get Eretz Yisrael. They're going to be exiled and enslaved for 400 years. Only after that will you get Eretz Yisrael. So one question is, what's motivating this opinion? Why suggest that this is the sin of Abraham? So I'm going to share my screen again and look in the Psukim and see where this came up. So it seems that Shmuel, I think, is probably motivated by two things. First of all, he's motivated by the fact that if Avram is the one who is told that his children are going to be enslaved, Hashem must be telling Abraham for a reason. Maybe it's because Abraham himself is the one who sinned. And so a lot of people are going to try to figure out, well, what sin did Abraham do? Second thing that's motivating Shmuel is that it's Perek Tedvav itself in which the decree of exile is given. And so he says, well, what happened right before this decree? And if we just scroll up a few psukim, you see that right before this decree was Avram's question, B'mei da'aki Hashem. So textually, Shmuel, I think, is on good grounds. We have a statement of Avram. Right after that statement, Hashem says, you're going to be punished. And he puts two and two together and says, oh, it must be for that. Not everyone agrees, though, that this is such a problematic sin, because this is not even necessarily a question of doubt, one might put it in the framework of doubt, but one can also just say that Avram's just literally asking, how do I know? Give me a sign. And so other people suggest, well, maybe, yes, it could be Avraham who sinned, but maybe it was a different sin. And so we'll look at the second opinion brought in the Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Shehefrish b'nei Adam milikanes tachat kanfei hashchina. Rabbi Yochanan says, what was his problem? What was Abraham's sin? Because he distanced people from entering under the wings of the divine presence. As it is stated, Timli hanefesh v'harachush kachlach. Give me the people and take the goods to yourself. So to give you a little context, this comment is mentioned in Bereshit Perek Yudaled, the story of the 4 kings versus the 5 kings, when all those kings come and attack Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities in the area, and Avram comes and fights against them. At the end, when Abraham has won the war and he collects all this booty, etc., okay, we have a discussion between him and the king of Sodom, and Abraham has the option, if he had wanted to take both the people that he'd gotten as captives, and he could also take the booty. And instead, he decides that he's not going to take anything. And the Gemara here, Rabbi Yochanan says, no, you had this opportunity to go and convert all of those people that were living in Sodom to Judaism. And instead, you missed it. You didn't take that opportunity. Okay? And many of us wonder, what opportunity, why would he do this? What's wrong with this? Okay? So if we think about it, again, do a what if. How would history have been different? How had Abraham converted those people, taken them under his wing, not given them back to the king of Sodom to go back and live in Sodom, but take them captive, not necessarily as captives, but take them into his household and convert them and train them into belief of Judaism and monotheism? How would history have been different? So I think there's 2 important things that might have been different. First of all, the entire destruction of Sodom might not have happened. Right? Sodom was destroyed because of the evil of the ways of the people in it. Maybe Avram could have changed all those people, been this amazing role model for them, and had them all become good people, and we wouldn't have had the destruction of Sodom. I think there's other important thing, and that is, perhaps had Abraham converted all of the people of Sodom, then maybe the way that we would have come to become in charge of Eretz Yisrael would have been by inheriting the land through mass conversions instead of through conquest. Now, it's true, one might question, but Judaism is not a religion of proselytizing, though it is interesting that Rabbi Yochanan himself, who makes this comment, is known for being pro-proselytizing. So that might be one of the things that's motivating him. But I do think it's a very interesting concept. Maybe there was an alternative route. Instead of the ultimate route, which was by conquest, had Abraham decided to convert the people around him and bring them under the wings of the Shekhinah, bring them to Judaism that way, maybe we would have inherited Canaan in peaceful means and not through war. But Abraham didn't take that route, and so Hashem tells him, no, now you're not going to inherit it this way. You're going to have to inherit it a different way. You're going to have to leave and then come back. So those are 2 opinions that are brought in the Gemara. Both have in common that they're attributing the sin to Abraham. They're looking for a sin that is close to when the covenant between the pieces was made. According to the first opinion, it's in the same exact parak. According to the second opinion, it's the previous parak. So again, it could be an easy reaction. But for many, neither Abraham's decision not to go and take the people of Sodom and convert them, nor Abraham's questioning, how do I know that I will inherit it, is a really significant sin. And for sure, perhaps not one that would justify 400 years of oppression. Which leads Ramban to another possible sin, again, attributing the sin to Avram for the same reason, because Avram is the one who's foretold of the decree. Maybe Avram the one that sinned. And let's look at him inside. Okay. We're going to start with the second paragraph in Ramban, and then we'll move back up to the first one. Ramban tells us, תדע כי אברהם אבינו חטא חטא גדול בשגגה, שהביא אשתו הצדקת במכשול עוון מפני פחדו פן יהרוג. Says Avraham Avinu sinned a great sin by accident, that he brought his righteous wife into a stumbling block of sin on account of his fear that they might kill him. He should have trusted in Hashem that he would save him and his wife and all that he had. Because after all, Hashem has the power to help and to save. And also his decision to leave the land that he'd been commanded upon beforehand, because of the famine, that was the sin that he sinned. Ramban here is talking about one of the very first stories that we know about Avraham Avinu. He's talking about the story when, due to famine, Avraham decides to leave Israel very soon after he was told to make Aliyat Lachacha. Right after that, there's a famine in Israel, and Avraham decides there's no food here. I need to go to a place where there's food, and he goes down to Egypt to get food. And he takes his wife with him. As he gets to Egypt, though, he realizes that there's a real fear that the people in Egypt will kill him in order to take her as a wife. And so he suggests to her, could you please pretend that you're my sister, etc. Ramban sees both of these actions, meaning his endangering Sarah by asking her to pass herself off as his sister, because in so doing, by passing herself off as available, he definitely raises raises the stakes in the sense that she's going to be much more likely to be taken. And second, or maybe first, the fact that he decided to leave Israel itself. Says both of these are sins. And he says not only are they sins, but that as a result of these sins, Va'al ha'maseh hazeh nigzar al zar'o hagalut be'eretz Mitzrayim biyad Paro. Says, and because of this action, it was decreed upon his descendants the exile in Mitzrayim under the hand of Paro. B'makom hamishpat shama haresha b'achit. He says, in the place of justice, that's where there was the sin. So for Ramban, Abraham is being punished for his actions in the 12th chapter of Sefer Bereshit when he decides to put his wife in danger and when he decides to leave Eretz Israel. And because of that, he said, Galut Mitzrayim was necessary. The exile was fitting punishment. Ramban suggests that there's something that supports his understanding of the story, and that's that there's many parallels between the story of Abraham in Egypt and the story of Bnei Israel's descent to Egypt and what happens in Sefer Shemot. Okay, before I even look at Ramban, I want you guys to take a minute in your head and try to think. Can you think of what parallels are there between the two stories? So I'll give you a second to think. And we're going to look at this not in Ramban, but I'm going to share a quick visual that might make it quicker to see the different parallels. Okay. Okay. So he starts by pointing out, in both cases, the story starts off because of a famine. So in Avram's case, there was a famine that leads him down to Egypt. In the case of Am Yisrael, the brothers go down to Egypt because there's a famine in the land, and the language in both cases is very similar. Ki kaved hara'av ba'aretz, the harav kaved ba'aretz, same language. Okay. In both cases, as a result, they decide to go down specifically to Egypt. Vayired Avram Mitzrayma, v'yardu Achi Yosef, v'yardu Mitzrayma. Again, same language. The brothers go down to Egypt. Avram had gone to Egypt. Ramban points out there's another parallel. There's a saving of the we talk about saving the woman and killing the man, or perhaps the woman being endangered in different ways. So we have Abram says to Sarah, maybe they'll keep you alive, but they're going to kill me. We have the same thing in Ben-Hu going. If the boy was born, they were told to kill him. But if she's a woman, she should live. And according to some version, the reason that they wanted the women to live was because the Egyptians were interested in taking them, just like Paro ended up taking Sarah. Okay. In both cases, there's a punishment of the Egyptians, and similar language, a nega, a plague, comes upon them. Finally, they're sent out with a lot of wealth. Abraham is sent out and made wealthy due to Paro's having taken Sarah. He has sheep and he has cattle and he has camels. when Bnei Israel leave, we're also told they're going to leave with great wealth. And as we know, they go borrow all of those vessels and come out with great wealth. So for Ramban, if one's thinking about what are the advantages of his position, again, he chooses Avram because Avram's the one who's foretold of the decree. 2, he finds a sin that's close by, that's a couple prakim beforehand. But for Ramban, the real thing that's driving him is all these parallels. He says, look, the 2 stories are so similar. And he says this is an example of that things that happen to the parents happen to the children. People might have heard the phrase the actions of the fathers are a sign for the children. That's an idea that Ramban uses a lot in his commentary. Here too, he notes, look what happens to the children. It's exactly what had happened to the fathers. And in this case, he says, why is it that history is repeating itself? Because history, future history, is a punishment for prior history. One might still ask a lot of questions from this approach. For example, is this really a sin? The fact that Avram decided to leave Israel when there's a famine, why is that problematic? Ralbag, for example, Rabbi Levi ben Gershom, a Provençal commentator, totally takes Ramban to task and says, not only was it not a sin, he suggests that it's something that we should totally learn by and emulate. Avram decided that he can't rely on a miracle. There's a famine. Of course, I'm supposed to leave Eretz Yisrael. So it's not so obvious that Avram's actions in our story are problematic. Ramban thinks they are. Many other Mefarshim do not. And again, with the question, and even if they are they problematic enough to justify 400 years of enslavement and 400 years of exile? Another, though, I think, important question, and this is not just on Ramban, but it's a question on this entire approach that attributes that sin to Abraham, is if Abraham was the one who sinned, why is it that he himself doesn't suffer at all? Abraham lives his life until his death, Baruch Hashem, without any problems. It's only the future generations that go into exile. The future generations, they're going to be oppressed and in bondage. Why is that fair that the children should suffer if he's the one that sinned? So this leads us to Mefarshim that say it must not have been Abraham who sinned. It must have been somebody else. So let's take a peek at Abraham and see what he suggests. So I'm sharing my screen. I hope everyone can see. Okay, so Abraham suggests maybe it's not Avram who is to blame, but instead the next generation, or perhaps 2 generations down the line, Yaakov says. He says, "V'omar she'im nodeh shehaya galut mitzrayim chet v'avon kodem." He says, if we're going to agree that exile in Egypt was because of some prior sin, ein ra'oi shenachshavehu b'chet Avram. Better not attribute it to Abraham. Chalila lo mevan, chas v'shalom, that he should have said. V'sheyoter ra'oi sheniyachasehu l'shiftei b'nei Yaakov. Better to attribute it to the tribes of Yaakov. Because there it's a bit more explicit that they did something wrong. In their baseless hatred of Yosef, and they're plotting to kill him when he was going to go and say their piece, when he was going to say hello to them, and by throwing him into the pit, and of course, and they're selling him to Egypt. That's he said, because they sinned, it makes sense that they should get a punishment. So here Barbanel says, let's try to find the sin where the people who sinned are the same people who are going to be the ones getting punished. It says the brothers sinned by selling Yosef, by throwing him into the pit, by plotting to kill him. And so it is they who are exiled to Egypt. Here too, he suggests, we can find lots of measure for measure punishments. There's lots of parallels between the story of Yosef and his brothers and the story of Am Yisrael in Mitzrayim. Okay, so again, think for yourselves before we look at what Abarbanel himself says. What parallels do you see between the 2 stories? How is it a measure for measure punishment that the brothers go down to Egypt? So here too, we're going to look at a chart and at a Barbanel inside. And we can see, sorry, hold on. Okay. We can see a whole bunch of parallels between Yosef and his brother's experience and the Egyptian bondage. First of all, slavery in Egypt. So what's the measure for measure punishment? The tribes go down to Egypt, are enslaved by the Egyptians, as measure as you can get. Okay. In addition, Abarbanel suggests the brothers are the ones who lead Yosef down to Egypt, okay, by selling him. Yosef, in the end, is the one who leads his brothers down to Egypt at the end of the story when he convinces them to come and move to Egypt. He says, look, Yosef was thrown into a pit. What parallel do we see in the story of the Egyptian bondage? The babies are thrown into the Nile. He adds, the brothers plot while they're shepherding their sheep. The nation is enslaved to people who worship sheep. Finally, he points out that the brothers had used a bloody goat to act as a cover-up when they were smearing its blood onto the coat in order to hide their deed in front of their father. That in the Egyptian bondage, a bloodied sheep, meaning the Korban Pesach, served as atonement. So Abarbanel, like Ramban, says, oh, look, we can find all sorts of parallels. And in this case, they're measure for measure punishments. And so he says, look, this is a great case where we could see it's very obvious the connection then between the crime and the punishment. And the same people who are doing the sinning are the people who are suffering. So he says this is a much better option if I'm looking for a sin. Not everyone agrees though, and there's many questions one can ask on Abarbanel's approach as well. First of all, why should Avram already been foretold of this event if it's only something that relates to his children? Two, why, just like we asked with Abraham, are the descendants the ones who suffer, in the sense that, yes, the brothers go into exile, but the brothers themselves are not actually the people who are enslaved. So even though Abarbanel makes it sound like, even though Abarbanel makes it sound like, oh, the brothers are being punished measure for measure, the brothers get exiled, but they don't actually get enslaved. It's only the next generation that's going to be enslaved. Someone might ask a further question. If this is a measure for measure punishment for the brothers' sin, so then who else should not be included in the punishment? Descendants of Yosef, descendants of Binyamin, who were not part of the entire sale, and Reuven, who also was trying to save Yosef and not part of him. So one might question, well, only some of the tribes then should have been punished, not all of them. One last question, which I think is also an important question, is how can you decree punishment for something that hasn't yet happened? Meaning, if Avraham Avinu has already been told that in the future this is going to happen, it sounds like the decree of punishment was decreed already in the time of Abraham, yet at that point, the people hadn't yet sinned. So how does Abarbanel address these questions? So he doesn't address all of them. One important one, though, that he does address is the question of why is it that the descendants are the ones who are suffering and being enslaved themselves, as opposed to the brothers who were the ones who committed the crime? And second, how can the decree of punishment be decreed before the crime is committed? So we'll start with the second one. The second one, he says, well, look, there are parallels to that elsewhere in Tanakh. And he points to Sefer Dvarim in the Tochacha and the rebuke of Sefer Dvarim, where we're foretold of punishments that will happen in the future, even though we haven't yet committed the crime. Okay? And he's right, there's a whole lot of punishments written out in that Tochacha and that rebuke, and we haven't yet sinned. There's a big difference though. And this might be a question on Abarbanel. In the case of the Tochacha, it's presented as if you sin, this is the punishment that's going to happen. Not just a decree of punishment, but there's a connection where you say it's sort of conditional. If you're going to sin, well, this is going to be the punishment, which allows one then not to sin. In our case, we seem to have a flat out decree, not a conditional decree, which again makes you wonder, well, if it's punishment for sin, but the sin didn't happen yet, why is that fair? As far as why is it the next generation, let's look inside at what Abarbanel says. Okay, so Abarbanel suggests, Va'amnam, בני השבטים וזרעים נשארו בגלות בסביבת אבותיהם, וכמאמר הנביא, אבותינו חטאו ואינם, ואנחנו עוונותיהם סבלנו. He says, look, the descendants of the tribes stayed in exile because of their father's sins. And just like the Navi later in Eicha says, look, our fathers sinned, but we're suffering for their sins. So too, the descendants of the tribes are the ones who suffered for the sins of the tribes. Why is that fair? He answers, הנה השבטים נכנסו בעצם וברשונה בגלות ההוא, והבנים נשארו אחריהם. וכבר כתב הרב"ג וכיוצא בזה, היה עונש האבות בעצם ועונש הבנים במקרא. So Barbanel here quotes Rabag and says, look, Rabag has explained this elsewhere, where he has explained that sometimes, yes, a father will get his punishment for his own sin. Why are the children also getting punished? He says, bimikra, by happenstance. What does he mean by that? He says, they actually suffer just the natural consequences of the punishment of the father, sort of collateral damage. So for example, elsewhere where Rabag talks about this, he speaks about it with an example of, let's say a person stole, and as a result, their money is taken away from them by the government. Says, yes, the father's punishment is on the father, but who's going to suffer? Not just the father, but the children are going to punishment as a consequence of their father's deed. So too, he suggests, in the case that we're talking about, Bnei Yisrael went into exile. That was their punishment. What was the natural consequence of being in exile? Oppression often happens in exile. And so, yes, this is collateral damage, but that often happens. Okay? And so that's how Barbanel answers that question. It might speak to some people might still question that's still unjust. Okay? Let's move to one last possibility as far as this, looking at this in terms of sin and punishment. And here I'm not going to read this inside. I'm just going to summarize. Rabag and Sforno suggests, let's not look at the generation upon which the decree was given. In other words, it's not the sin of Abraham that we have to look at, nor the generation which was exiled itself, which is the brothers, but maybe it's the generation itself who was enslaved that sinned. And each of them tries to come up then with what sin was it that Bnei Yisrael did? Because as we said before in the introduction, if you say for Shemot, it's not going to be so easy to find sin. So Rabag picks up, Rabbeinu Levi ben Gershom picks up on a sin on the Ben Adam L'Chaveru level, on the interpersonal level. Sforno picks up on a sin on the Ben Adam L'Makom level. Rabag suggests that if you look at the story of Moshe hitting the Egyptian and read the ending where it sounds like that people, that word was given of what happened to the king, with the suggestion being that Israelites saw it and they shared it, they were slandering. And so he says, look, there was a big lack of interpersonal behavior on the part of Am Yisrael in Egypt, people who were slandering each other, not treating each other with respect. He says, even though the story that I just mentioned happens after they're enslaved, he says, chances are that's something that was going on throughout. And it's for their interpersonal behavior and lack of respect for each other that they're punished. And what's their punishment? They're not going to be respected. They're not going to be treated well interpersonally. They're going to be treated as slaves. Sforno picks up on a Ben Adam L'Makom and says, even though Sefer Shemot does not mention any sin of Am Yisrael, where we do see sin of Am Yisrael is in Sefer Yechezkel, which says explicitly that the people in Egypt, Vayamrubi v'lo avu l'shmo elai, ish et shikutzei einehem lo hishlichu, ve'gilulei Mitzrayim lo azab. That they rebelled against me, meaning the people in Egypt rebelled against Hashem. They did not listen to me. They did not cast out those detestable things, in other words, a euphemism for idolatry, and they did not forsake the idols of Egypt. So Sefer Yechezkel says explicitly that the Bnei Yisrael, while they were in Egypt, were idolaters. And Sforno says idolatry is a very big sin, and so it's something that perhaps justifies a very big punishment. Okay. What one might do with this entire approach is, of course, mix and match. It's possible to say that perhaps the exile, for example, was for the sins of the brothers, but the enslavement was for sins of Bnei Yisrael that were already in Mitzrayim. And thus, they're getting punished. The people who are suffering are the people who commit the crime. This entire approach, though, doesn't speak to everybody. Many people are uncomfortable with suggesting that if we're suffering, it must be for punishment, because they say, look around you. You see lots and lots of people who do not seem to have done something wrong and nonetheless are still suffering. And if it's not explicit in the text, why do we have to connect sin and punishment? Maybe something else is going on. And just to give you an example of someone who is very, very against looking at this entire story as being one about sin and punishment, Rav Chasdai Kreskes looks at our story and views it in the prism of what's going on in his own time period. He's living through the Spanish pogroms of 1391. Right? His entire community is being decimated. And he's thinking about the suffering of his own community and saying, this is not punishment for sin. And he explicitly connects it to the story of Galut Mitzrayim, and I'll read it together. He says it's possible that just as it was in the exile in Egypt, that it was not coming as a punishment for some prior sin, but it was somehow meant to somehow bring us closer to God. He says, so too in our own exile. He says, it's possible that our own exile too is not coming as punishment for sin. The people of our time are not suffering because they did something wrong, but rather these are what we might call yisurim shel ava, trials of love, somehow meant to bring us closer to Hashem. And so there's a whole, I think, group of commentators who move away from that whole suggestion that this must be punishment for sin and suggest instead this is somehow to help Am Yisrael grow. This was meant to be some type of a formative experience to either educate the Israelites or otherwise mold them as a nation. So the question, of course, then is which lessons were they meant to take from the experience? And were these lessons something that they couldn't have gotten with that much, with all that suffering? So again, let's start with Rambam, who suggests that the point of the experience in Egypt was to strengthen belief in Hashem. And he says, we'll read it together. He's picking up on a pasuk in Tzif Midbar, where Hashem says, I took you out of Egypt, liot lachem Elohim. He says, look, this pasuk gives a reason. Why did I take you out? To be for you a God. Somehow the process was meant for Bnei Yisrael to recognize Hashem. And Rabag here, interestingly, is picking up on not the stages that we looked at until now, the suffering, but actually the redemption itself. But says the redemption would have been possible without first suffering. So he says, he took them out of Egypt so that he could become for them a God. And this came from the great wonders that Bnei Yisrael saw as Hashem took them out. And he says, Abraham, actually we'll skip that part for interest of time. And he says, look, all of those makot, all of the plagues, they were all meant to instill in Bnei Yisrael belief in Hashem. And I think if we were to scan the Parshiot, the Prakim, that talk about the makot in Sefer Shemot, we will see that Rabag is correct, that there's a refrain that repeats again and again. And I'm going to share a little bit here where this is a program called Ma'abadat HaTanakh, the Tanakh Lab from alatorah.org, which looks for repeating words, milot manchot, words that serve as a refrain, or in some cases, phrases that serve as a refrain. And they're highlighted in yellow. I'm just going to scan through so you can see really quickly how often in the 4 chapters that discuss the plagues, we're given the idea that the reason this is coming is V'yedatem ki ani Hashem Elokechem. You should know that I am Hashem, your God. Just scrolling down, looking at the yellows. V'yadu Mitzrayim ki ani Hashem, and Egypt should know that I am God. V'zot teda ki ani Hashem. Through this, you should know that I am Hashem. Leman teda ki ein kashem Elokeinu, so you should know that there's no God like our God. Leman teda ki ani Hashem b'kerev ha'aretz, you should know that I am Hashem in the midst of the land. I'm still involved in the land. Bavor teda ki ein kamoni b'chol ha'aretz, that you should know that there's none like me in the entire land. And finally, Leman teda ki laHashem ha'aretz, oh, even more than that, one more. V'yadatem ki ani Hashem, and you should know that I'm Hashem. So this is obviously refrained throughout the prakim that talk about the process of the redemption. The reason that Hashem was giving all those signs and miracles were both that the Egyptians should come to recognize Hashem, but also that Bnei Israel themselves should come to recognize Hashem. And so Ralbag suggests that maybe the entire experience was necessary in order to get to belief in Hashem, so that Bnei Israel can come to know Hashem in a way that they wouldn't have been able to otherwise. Nechama Leibowitz goes in a different direction. And like we saw before, when people are looking at potential sins, here too, when we're looking at potential values to be instilled, she says the value that was instilled wasn't a bein adam l'makom, was not between man and God, but rather between man and his fellow man. And she says, Ulam tshuva meduyeket yoter l'tam hagalut. She says, if we're going to look for a reason for the exile, we can find one that's educational. We can look, if we look in the Torah itself, she says, go take a peek in Torah itself and you'll find the reason. Where? Says, you look at those verses which talk about the exile and enslavement as a reason for mitzvot. And she points out that if you look, especially in Sefer Dvarim, but in other books as well, you'll see lots of times that we're given a mitzvah and we're saying, and remember that you were foreigners, or remember that you were a slave in Egypt. And here too, one does a concordance search. And I'll show you one that I already did. We won't do it together, but I'll show you one that I had already put in. So I did a concordance search for where the words ger, eretz, and Mitzrayim. This is also from the concordance of Torah.org. You stick in those three words, see where they come up. Every place it says, don't oppress the foreigner because you were foreigners in Egypt. Don't oppress the foreigners, remember you were foreigners in Egypt. Don't oppress the foreigner because you were, right? 4 times we have the same exact language. Similarly, if one were going to look at a slightly different language, remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Again, we have a whole bunch of mitzvot not to oppress your own slaves. Recognizing to give the zakat to the poor and to the widow and to the orphan because you were slaves. All sorts of mitzvot that relate to social welfare are all explained in terms of you were slaves, you were foreigners, you went through it. Therefore, make sure that you treat others well. And so Nechama Leibowitz suggests that perhaps the entire experience was meant to instill in Am Yisrael empathy so that they can treat others better in the future. Now, I think it's a beautiful idea on one hand, but I think one has to really question, is this a lesson that could not have been instilled in any other way? Does it really justify 400 years worth of exile and enslavement? And in addition, she makes it sound like because you felt it on your own flesh, that's why you're going to be more attuned to it. But the problem is, we didn't actually feel it on our own flesh. I'm reading about it. I didn't actually feel enslavement any more than anybody else did. Do I really have better appreciation of what it means to be enslaved, what it means to be a foreigner than any person from a different nationality? So yes, it's part of our Jewish consciousness, it's part of our collective memory, but does something being part of my collective memory really mean that I'm going to be more empathetic than someone else? So I think Muhammad's understanding works in some ways in a different direction. I'm not so sure that one could say this is why Hashem enslaved us. But I think that if you look at the story from the opposite perspective and say, well, once we were enslaved, what can I learn from it? What can I take away from my suffering? Yes, this is a message that you could take away. And in some ways, that question is perhaps even a more useful question. When suffering happens, I might never be able to answer, why did Hashem make me suffer? But what I can always look into is, what can I take from that suffering? What can I learn from it? Where can I help others from it? And here, Nechama, I think, is 100% correct. Yes, take that experience to make sure that you're empathetic to others. Okay, with that, I want to move into one last reading of what we were supposed to be learning from it. And here we'll really see how people are taking their own time period and what's going on in their own time period and connecting it back to the enslavement. So Rav Hirsch tells us, אם לכם הורה שהתקים בצורה דומה את דרכי ההשגחה האלוקית בארץ כנען לא הייתה משפחת יעקב נסיך לה. He says, let's ask the what if question. What would have happened had Bnei Israel stayed in Canaan and had never been forced into exile, had never been enslaved? He says, Bnei Israel, had they stayed in Canaan, would never have become Bnei Israel. They would never have turned into a nation. He says, what would have happened? He says, if they had stayed in Canaan, they would have assimilated to its surroundings. In order to become a nation without assimilation, היה עליה לבוא אל תוך אומה שמעצם טבעה התנגדה לתכונה היהודית, וזו הייתה מצרים. Says, in order to become a nation without assimilating, it was incumbent upon her to come into a nation which by its very nature opposed the Jewish character, and that was Egypt. So he points out, Bnei Israel staying in Canaan, they would have slowly assimilated. Already the children of Yaakov seem to be intermarrying. Okay? They don't go back to Mesopotamia to get their wife from the family of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, but rather marry people that are from Canaan, at least some of them. Okay? And he says that might have continued, and we wouldn't have been a big enough nation to combat that assimilation. So where did we have to go? We had to go to a nation that was anti-Semitic. Egypt found it abomination to go and eat bread with people like Am Yisrael, and so they separated them. They put them into the ghetto of Goshen and separated them. He said, that's where we were able to grow. He says, the Lachanikim, Hakanut Shabanta Getaot, he שהייתה כלי שרת בידי השם להרחיק אותנו מכל תרבות החטאים שהיא ביניהם. He says, and throughout history, ghettos play that same role. They're a tool in the hand of Hashem to distance us from the cultures of all the people around us, to ensure that we grow together as a nation. Okay, and he said that was necessary for Am Yisrael to grow. Once they become big enough, then they're going to be able to go back to Canaan without having to fear assimilation. The Netziv goes in a similar direction, but picks up on the next page. He actually suggests that Goshen wasn't really a ghetto, but was a shtetl. Says Goshen was a place that Yaakov wanted his people to live in because he wanted to guard them, not because of the anti-Semitism around, but because he said, we need to stay together. Let's stay in Goshen, one place. What did Bnei Israel decide, though? They weren't happy to stay in Goshen. And he picks up on the language of the Pasuk in Shemot that says, but the land was filled with them, and says, that means Bnei Israel filled the land. They left Goshen of their own volition to go and assimilate. And he says, and what then was Hashem's corrective? When people start to assimilate, he says, how does Hashem ensure that they remember that they're Jews, that they stop assimilating? And what he suggests is that the answer to assimilation is actually anti-Semitism. Hashem's remedy for our assimilation is anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism reminds everybody that they're Jewish, and there's nobody who can escape it. And if you think, the parallels to the Shoah, where people are assimilating and say, oh no, I'm German, but no, they get very rudely reminded that no, they're Jewish also. And so the Netziv suggests that actually the ghettos and the anti-Semitism and persecution is a remedy for assimilation. It's Hashem's cure, the whole door in all generations, to go and remind us who we are and to bring us back. So we've seen, I think, two main approaches so far. Those that understand this to be sin and punishment, with some people attributing it to Abraham, the generation in which the exile and enslavement was foretold. Other people saying, no, this is a sin and punishment for the tribes themselves, for the sale of Yosef, because they're the ones who are exiled. Third people who suggest that no, it must be Bnei Israel in Mitzrayim themselves who are exiled, who have sinned, either by not believing God, interpersonal sins or something like that. And we pointed out one can mix and match. Or perhaps no, this was somehow necessary for Am Yisrael to become a nation. Either because had they stayed in Canaan, they would have assimilated. They need to go to a country which did not like Jews, who would have left them alone in their ghetto of Goshen so that they could grow. Or according to the Netziv, when Bnei Israel decided to leave their ghetto of Goshen and to assimilate, Hashem stops that assimilation by bringing anti-Semitism. And he says, people who think that assimilation is going to stop anti-Semitism because everyone's going to like me because I'm doing like that, he says that's wrong. It doesn't work like that. Okay? Assimilation brings persecution. Persecution stops assimilation. Or those that say that the entire process was meant to bring us to recognition of Hashem. And yes, maybe the suffering didn't have people recognize Hashem, but had you not suffered first, you wouldn't have appreciated Hashem's salvation afterwards. And of course, Nechama Leibowitz, who suggests that we're supposed to learn from this how to be empathetic to others. I'm going to close with one last approach, which I'm going to just throw out for people to think about, where Abarbanel somewhat radically suggests that we should challenge the assumption that the bondage was divinely planned and must have had a purpose. And he says maybe Derech HaShlishi, he had brought a few different answers to our question. He says Derech HaBechira, the way of choice. Vinyano shelo yardu hashvatim lemitzrayim b'shvil ha'onesh, v'lo hayu muchachim lavo shama mitzad ha'gzeira ha'yonah l'tachlit tovatam, ela shahayu hamasim kulam l'chivi. He says, don't think that the exile and enslavement was a punishment for sin, nor was it some decree that somehow had an ulterior positive motive, but rather this is all the result of human volition and free will and their actions. Bnei Israel on their own had decided to go sell Yosef, and as a result, to go down to Egypt, and everything else followed from there. And Hashem allows them to go in the way that they choose and to suffer the consequences of the actions that they choose. What would motivate this approach? Why would someone want to say this isn't divinely planned, especially considering that we have it like in Brit Bein HaBitarim that's already decreed in the covenant? So of course, this solves the problem of did Hashem bring any evil? According to Barbanel, no, Hashem didn't bring evil. All Hashem did was save us from our own actions. We ourselves voluntarily took certain paths that led to certain problems. Hashem steps in to save us. Hashem steps in purely for this salvation. I want to end with wishes that everyone have a wonderful, wonderful Pesach. And Yirta Hashem, hopefully you have a lot to think about. I'm very happy for anyone to text me, or I assume you can get my information from Nishma if anyone wants to follow up on the conversation. And Yirta Hashem, we should all take the various lessons of from here to our Pesach Seders and to life as a whole.
Hello and welcome to this, our special Pesach Yom Iyun. I can't see everybody here, but I do see that we have a chat. So anybody who has questions in the middle, I'll try as much as possible to get onto the chat to be able to ask questions. In the meantime, I want to start just by inviting everybody, not just to this Yom Iyun and for getting ready for Pesach on the spiritual way, but also to Alisa Fleto programs in general. I am Navi Tzadik, the director of the Alisa Fleto programs here in Ishmat. And we have a special program coming back this summer, live. We've had the summer program, an amazing summer program, all different levels for everybody and all women from all over the world at any age who wants to learn Torah and make this summer the most special one, forming an amazing community of learners together here. Thank God, with a little break of Corona that we did this on Zoom, we're back here in Israel on campus in the heart of Yerushalayim. So I welcome everybody to that. Plus, we have an online baby drash that goes on throughout the year that you can always join any part of and be part of any of our shiurim. We also have in Lisa Fleto post-college program for people who are post-college and women who want to come in here and learn for the year post-college. So all that information is on the website, and you can always email us and get more involved. So we are here now to talk about building the next generation of Am Yisrael. Okay, if you can, and I didn't prepare this ahead of time to tell everyone that they should have a Tanakh in front of them. But if you can have the Psukim and a Tanakh in front of you, that would be great, besides for the other sources that I'm going to try to share on screen. And feel free again to chat and to say anything, and I will try to pay attention to chat as much as possible, since I can't see everybody who's here. Okay, so we might ask ourselves, what is the most central focus of the night? We're coming to the Seder night with a lot of preparation, physically, spiritually, cleaning, getting ready, and we take a deep breath and come to the Seder night. And then we ask ourselves, so what's the focus of this night? Is it possibly eating the matzah and remembering how we left Egypt and how God took us out? Possibly it's the Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach was so central in the amount of laws for eating the Korban Pesach. And it's one out of two mitzvot that, even though it's a positive commandment, anybody who refrains from doing so is liable to the very strict punishment of karet, of getting cut off from the Jewish people. So seemingly it has to do with that also. But like I see is already put on the chat, teaching the children is the most important mitzvah here. So let's see if we can really see where this comes from about teaching the children and how this is such a focus of this night. So firstly, where do we have Pesach first mentioned in the Tanakh? We might think that Pesach first mentioned in the Tanakh is in Sefer Shmot, where we're leaving Egypt. Before we left Egypt, how could we possibly have Pesach? But actually, Rashi points out that Pesach is mentioned a few times in Sefer Bereshit. Surprisingly, we have Pesach when Avraham Avinu is having his guests come, and they are angels, but he doesn't know that to begin with. And as they're coming into his house, he's getting his whole family involved in this amazing mitzvah of serving the guests. So first of all, he goes to Sarah, his wife, and he says, here, you get these ugot, okay? Ugot we translate today as cakes, but the truth is they're mentioned also with the matzot. When Am Yisrael were leaving Egypt, it says ugot matzot. They made ugot matzot. And here too, it talks about Sarah Imenu making the ugot. So that's some connection of Pesach. And Abraham is getting Ishmael, his son, also involved in getting the meat for the guests, and then he's standing there waiting on them. And one of the things that the guests came to tell him was that they're having a son. And it says, Ke'et Chaya, meaning at this time next year, assuming that's how we translate it, you are going to have a son. And Rashi points out there, Ke'et Chaya, it's going to be on Pesach. That's when it was. They came to tell him on Pesach that he was going to have a son. And that's when Yitzchak Avinu was going to be born, is on Pesach. Following that whole incident is the story of Sodom and Amorah, and how Hashem destroys Sodom. Right before Hashem destroys Sodom, in Bereshit, it talks about how Hashem mentions to Avraham that he's planning on destroying all of Sodom. And as he's mentioning this to Avraham, he seems to be almost talking out loud, talking to himself, and Hashem says, mi-Avraham asher ani oseh. Okay, so if we want, anyone who wants to look at the psukim inside, the whole story that we were talking about before is in Parshat Vayera, okay, which is in Bereshit, chapter 18, Yud-Chet. And there we see how Abraham gets everybody involved, and on Pasuk Yud, it says, Ke'et Chaya v'hinei ben v'sara ishtacha, meaning in 1 year from now, which is Pesach. And then later on in that parak, Pasuk Yud Zayin, Hashem says seemingly to himself, V'Hashem amar hamechaseh ani me'Avraham asher ani oseh. Should I hide from Avraham what I'm going to do? Almost in parentheses, he blesses Abraham and says Abraham is going to be this huge nation, and everyone is going to bless him. And the next pasuk in the verse 19, it says, Ki yadati v'leman asher yitzaveh et banav ve'et beito acharav. I know that Avraham Avinu is going to give this on to the next generations after him. V'shamru derech Hashem lasot tzedakah mishpat. And they will go in the path of God, doing justice and righteous beings. They will do this. So that Hashem gives Abraham all these blessings. And then Hashem tells him all about Sodom, and Abraham has an argument with Hashem. All this basically happening seemingly on Pesach, at least that's what Chazal say, that's what Rashi quotes. The next parak is two of the angels that were told, this is Gabriel and Raphael. Raphael was there to save Lot, and Gabriel is there to get rid of Sodom and to demolish it. And they get to Lot, and Lot right away invites these guests also. The difference is, if we read the psukim inside, is that Lot is doing this on his own. He's not getting his whole family involved, and definitely not his wife, who turns into a pillar of salt in the end of this story. According to Chazal, she turned into a pillar of salt. It's true that she looked back, which is why she turned into a pillar of salt, but why salt? She could have turned into sand. Seemingly it was salt because she wasn't even willing to give the guests even something so simple as salt. So not only was he not involving his wife, but it was just, they were so not on the same page on this whole inviting. And when we talk about his children, he was willing to sacrifice his daughters in a very horrible way for the sake of these guests, instead of trying to sort of create this energy that the family is all part of this, inviting these guests. And when it says in the pasuk that he makes a whole meal for them, including matzot, it says in the verse 3, Vayiftzal ba'ma'od, meaning he really, really tries to convince them to come, even though originally it said, no, it's okay, we'll just sleep outside. And it says, Vayasu elav vayavo el beito vayasna mishte umatzot afa v'yochel. He makes for them matzot. And Rashi says, why on earth would you make matzot if it wasn't Pesach? Meaning, obviously, no one's eating that outside of Pesach. It must have been Pesach. Of course, it was the same time period that we were just talking about, where they were coming to Avraham, so it makes sense that it was Pesach. The next time in Sefer Bereshit that we see Pesach happening is when Yitzchak was giving a blessing to his children. He was planning on giving a certain blessing to Esav, but Rivka thought that was not a good idea, and therefore changed around what was happening. and planned it so that he gives it to Yaakov instead. But what we do see is that this idea of Yitzchak wanting to give over the blessing. And he says, I'm old. That's what it says in Breshit Kaf Zayin, anybody who wants to see it in front of them. And Pasuk Bet. Hinena Zadzakanti, I'm old already. Lo yadati yomuti, I'm not sure when I'm going to die. Rashi explains, it's Pesach. It's Pesach, and the righteous, their birthday and the date that they die is the same day. And therefore, he knew that this was coming close. It wasn't exactly coming close because it happened way later on when he actually died. But the fact that Pesach was coming up is when he felt like this is what's happening. And then when Rivka hears this and wants the blessing to go to Yaakov, in the meantime, it says in Pasuk Tet, Lechna el Hatzon, okay, so go to the cattle, Vekach misham shnei gedei izim, tovim, go take 2 good goats. On that, Rashi says, whoa, is that Yitzchak Avinu's lunch? Because that's massive. To have 2 full goats for lunch, how could that be? And then he says, actually, this is Pesach. One was Korban Pesach, and one was Korban Chagiga. And he was actually having these 2 sacrifices, and that's what was going on here. So again, we see this idea of Pesach coming up way before what we have later on in Shemot, which is Chag HaMatzot. Meaning we do have these matzahs afterwards, and we do have the whole story connected to this Chag HaPesach, but seemingly we have some kind of origin, some kind of raw idea of Chag HaPesach, even in Sefer Bereshit. So it's true, it's not the pshat, but that might even make it the message even stronger, because Chazal keeps saying there's Pesach here. Pesach was even before we were taken out of Egypt. And the question is, what's the message of Pesach in Bereshit? That maybe we can find out what the message in the same one is in Shemot when it comes up. And it's seemingly very, very, very much connected to giving us over to another generation. Avraham Avinu at the time didn't have any children, even though he was blessed with Yitzchak at the time, which was on Pesach. When he was doing this wasn't Avraham giving this over to his children. This was Hashem recognizing, and this is what he says to himself also, or seemingly in the Tanakh, Hashem recognizing that this is Avraham. Avraham and Sarah were building a house of righteousness, of bringing over ethics and morals to many, many people, everybody actually that they met. They were calling out in the name of God. They were bringing people into their home. They were explaining, they were bringing this over the next generation. And therefore, it doesn't just have to be the next generation of children. Even without children, this is what they were doing. And here I want to share the screen and talk a little bit about what's happening at our Seder and how we can build from the Pesach that we see, the original Pesach in Bereshit. And then when we come into Shemot and we see this, how Chazal see how central this is to bringing this into the next generation. Besides for bringing it, also how we actually do that. So I'm going to share for a minute. Just have to first just find the document. Okay. Okay. Now let's see how we share this with everybody. Okay, I'm not back yet. All right, I have a little bit lost from this here. So let me see if I can get everyone back. Everyone can still see me, even though I think that the page is not being able to be shared. Okay. Maybe I'll leave it at this and just read from. Okay, I'm going to say the sources. If I can't really share them with everyone, I'm going to read them and hopefully we'll get them on screen maybe somehow afterwards. So the first source I wanted to look at is okay. In Masechet Pesachim, Kuf Tet Zayin. Okay, Amud Aleph. It says, the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Chacham beno shoalo. Okay, if you are the wise man, then your son might ask you, Ime no Chacham. If he's not a Chacham, then his wife might ask him. Seemingly, it might just be also situational, of course, if he has a son at the table or not a son at the table. Be'im lav, and if not, hu sho'el atzmo, he asks himself. ואפילו שני תלמידי חכמים שיודעים בהלכות הפסח שואלים זה לזה. And even two great rabbis who are sitting at the Pesach table, they should be asking each other. Okay, so it starts with your son asking you the questions, and then it goes on to say, if you don't have the son there, it could be your wife asking the questions. But more interesting is that when you're all by yourself, you're asking yourself questions. And even if you have two Talmidei Chachamim who are talking about what's happening the Seder night, they should be asking each other questions. And the question is, what's with the asking questions? Meaning, why do we need them to be asking each other questions? Why wouldn't it just be enough to telling the story? Why do they actually have to be asking questions? Okay. Okay, so seemingly this is the way Chazal see that we should be focusing, is we should be asking questions, and that's how we're supposed to be giving over the information on Seder night. Even so much so that the wise people ask each other questions. Okay. So before we go on to the reason for questions, we can see how central it is, and it's almost like a wild card when we talk about Pesach in general. The wild card is, why we do certain things is just because we want to get people to start asking questions. So the very first Shulchan Aruch on this page says, מצווה לחלק לתינוקות כליות ואגוזים כדי שיראו שינוי וישאלו. Okay, the klayot ve'egozim is like the essentially the like chocolates and things that they were getting, treats. And it says you should be giving this out so that they'll see something different, meaning the kids will see something different, and they'll ask about that, why you're giving them their dessert when we haven't even started the meal. And in the Tosefta, okay, which is the fourth source on this page, Rabbi Lazar, which is Rabbi Elazar, but a lot of times it drops the aleph, אומר, חוטפים מצה לתינוקות בשביל שלא ישנו. רבי יהודה אומר, אפילו לא אכל אלא פרפרת אחת, אפילו לא טבל אלא חזרת אחת, חוטפים מצה לתינוקות בשביל שלא ישנו. Okay, Rabbi Lazar says you actually take away the matzah from the kids. The tinokot is not really babies, but in our case, kids, in order for them not to sleep. And Rabbi Yehuda says even if they ate very little, you take it away so that they don't sleep. And then there are all kinds of different understandings on how to understand what it means to take it away. Are you, giving them a little bit and then taking it away quickly so that they'll feel like, wait, what's going on here? I didn't even start the meal. Or are you making sure that they eat very little so that they don't get like overtired after they just have like a really big meal? Or are you making sure that everything goes by really, really quickly so that they don't fall asleep when you haven't even, gotten to Magid that much? So in the Rambam, underneath the Babli there, the Rambam says, mitzvah lahodia lebanim afilu lo shalu. It's a mitzvah to tell the sons, meaning the children there, even if they don't ask. Vehigadata lebincha. Lefi da'ato shel aviv melamdo, meaning depending on how much the kid understands, that is how much we're going to teach him. Ketzad, im haya katan o tipesh, if he was young or he wasn't smart, we just say to him, B'ni kulanu hayinu avadim, kamo shivchazu, kamo eved zu b'mitzrayim. We all were slaves, just like this slave or servant. We were all like that in Mitzrayim. And then this night, and Hashem took us out on this night. If the son is older and he's smart, then it tells him a lot more of the story and the miracles and meaning you have to line up with what he understands. Next halacha, he says, okay, you have to make something different. Nowadays we have like a set haggadah about what we're saying, but it's tricky because we also have to make certain differences still. Some things that people are not expecting, so that they see this and they're like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Meaning they shouldn't be just saying this because this is part of the Haggadah. They're supposed to be asking this question because it's actually a spontaneous, like, wait, what's going on here? Until they ask the question, and then you say to them, I'm so happy you asked. Let me explain to you. Okay, and how do you change things around? So you give them klayot be'egozim, meaning you give them some treats, and meaning you set the table and then you actually take away the table, which is why some people take away the seder plate from the table. Okay, and the way Rambam understands what's discussed in the Tosefta about how you take away the matzah is they're literally about to eat a matzah. You just like grab that away from them so that they ask questions. Okay. And then he says, Eno ben ishto shalo. If he doesn't have a son and his wife asks him, and if he doesn't have Eno isha shoalim ze laze, man ishtana halayla hazeh, afilu kulam chachamim. Even if everybody is smart enough, haya levado, and if he's all by himself singing the Seder night, shoel la'atzmo, he has to ask himself, man ishtana halayla hazeh. The Ravid on the Rambam says that his idea of taking away the matzahs from people doesn't make any sense. Of course, we said there are different understandings on what that means in the Tosefta to take away the matzah. But the Ravid says, Amar Avraham perush acher. That he wasn't right about the grabbing somebody's food out of their hands. Memaharim le'echol kedei shelo yishnu. Meaning you do everything pretty quickly so that they don't fall asleep. You don't dray around in shul before. I mean, you get there, you get to the tachlis, you start kiddush, so that you can keep your children awake enough so that we can explain to them what's happening. But the Rambam also very much emphasizes this whole idea of questions in the same way that the Tosefta does. And he says, you're all by yourself, so just ask a bunch of questions. And then, of course, the question is, what is this thing about asking questions that we're doing this way? So the two other things I want to talk about, first of all, is what is this idea of asking questions and why is that so focused here? And the second is, once we go into the questions of the different sons and children, we can maybe pay attention to what's actually happening there. Okay, so let's start with the questions, which is on the second page. See if I can get back to seeing everybody. Oh, here, I'm back. Okay, there are no sources on the screen, and that's my fault, but I think someone here is sharing. All right. Okay, thank you for sharing, because I'm not able to share. All right. So in Masechet Tmura, okay, it says, Gufa. This was the story that was brought up, roundabout way, is now brought up in a more focused way in the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, 3,000 halachot nishtakhu b'yemei avlo shel Moshe. 3,000 halachot were forgotten in the time of Moshe's being in mourning. Amru lo Yoshua, Sha'ah, they said to Yoshua, so ask. Amar lo b'shamayim, and he said, it's not in we can't ask God the heavens for this, it's not in the heavens. Amru lo Shmuel, so they said to Shmuel, ask. Amar lehem, elu hamitzvot, these are the mitzvahs. We're not allowed to create anything new, okay? Which seemingly is like almost the exact opposite answer of what Yoshua said. Yoshua said, lo b'shamayim, meaning this is not in the heavens, this is sort of up to us. And Shmuel says almost the exact opposite thing, which is a prophet is not allowed to make up anything new. meaning where are all these things coming from? Shamayim. So seemingly there's like two opposite things here, and this keeps coming up. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka, okay? Okay, one specific idea of somebody who need to give a sin offering, and then he died before he was able to give the sin offering, but the offering, meaning the animal was alive and well and was supposed to be given. What do you do with him if the person passes away? That was forgotten in the time that people were mourning Moshe because Moshe died. So they asked Pinchas, Sha'al, ask what you're supposed to do about this. Amar le lo b'shamayim hi, and Pinchas answers like Yehoshua, this is not in the heavens, this is something we have to figure out. Amar le Elazar, so they asked Elazar, Sha'al, you ask, and he says, Elu hamitzvot she'en navi rashay lechadesh davar me'ata. We can't say anything new, okay? Seemingly what's going on here is that there keeps coming up two different reasons for not asking. One is because it's not up to the heavens, meaning we got to make this decision. We're not going to ask the heavens because it's not up to the heavens to figure this out. We got to sit and figure this out. This is not a thing we can ask anybody. And the second is almost the exact opposite, which is we can't make up anything new, and therefore there's no reason to ask, because when you're asking, you're making up something new, which of course we would have to ask ourselves, how is that? What does that mean about asking a question? It almost sounds like every time you ask a question, it's like you're getting a new kind of answer, and it's not just something that's coming straight from the heavens. Whereas you might think that if you're asking a question, you're getting it straight from the heavens. That's the lo b'shamayim. And here, seemingly, there seems to be two reasons not to ask. Either because there's no reason to ask, it's not going to come up from there, we have to figure this out on our own, or there's no reason to ask because when you ask a question, it's coming from you. And when it's coming from you, it's like your new understanding of something. And this is not something new. This is something that was passed down for generations. No reason to ask something new and make up new laws. For both reasons, people are not asking. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav. And then we hear an interesting, harsh story that Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav. B'sha'a sheniftar Moshe Rabbeinu legan Eden. Amar lo Yoshua, shal mimeni kol sfekot sheyesh lecha. The time that Moshe Rabbeinu was going to Gan Eden, he was passing. He says to Yoshua, ask me any questions that you have, any doubts that you have. Amar lo Rebbe, and he says to him, Rabbi, klum enichticha sha'a achat v'alachti makom acher. I was always with you. I never went anywhere else. I never left you. Lo kach katavta bi. Didn't you write this in the Torah? Umisharto Yoshua bin Nun na'ar lo yamush mitoch ha'ohel, meaning I was constantly by your side. Yoshua was constantly by your side. I don't have any questions. Whatever you said, I got. It was passed down. Miyad tashash kocho Yoshua, and right away he lost some of his strength and understanding, and all of a sudden 300 halachot were lost. He forgot, and 700 doubts were in his mind, and all of Am Yisrael wanted to kill him. Then Hashem says to him, I can't tell you the answer. I can't tell him the answer. Seemingly, what did Yoshua say in the beginning of this whole passage that we have in Masechet Temurah? Lo b'shamayim hi, meaning Yoshua was the one who said, we have to figure this out. It's not up in the heavens. And then Hashem is almost getting back at him and saying, I can't give you the answer. And then he says, Lech v'toldam b'milchama. So go get them occupied with war. Shene'emar, like it says, Vayecharei mot Moshe evet Hashem, that Moshe was dying, and Vayomer Hashem v'gomer. And then all of a sudden, from that, there's this war that breaks out. Of course, we have the war of conquering Eretz Yisrael, which is what Yoshua was doing. But seemingly, part of the war that was taking so long was in order to sort of get Am Yisrael away from asking these questions, which is very, very interesting, because it seems to be also giving us a message that this survival mode that Am Yisrael were on, meaning they had to be at war and try to survive, was also a tactic so that they wouldn't be concentrating right now on what they were forgetting and on the questions that they were having. So it seems to be saying that survival mode is not the time of when we have like all kinds of new creative things. And what's interesting is we have two things going on here with the questions. One is the idea of it coming from Shamayim, meaning when you ask a question of Shamayim and you ask, a halachic ruling, you're getting something that's coming up from the heavens. On the other hand, the fact that it keeps coming in of we can't say something new, and the fact that Yehoshua said, I don't have any questions because I have everything that you taught me already, sounds like there was new material that was being lost by not asking the questions. So we have sometimes this like sort of balance that's happening. And when you ask a question, you're asking something from you, you're asking something new, you're asking something that wasn't there in the world yet. And on the other hand, you're attaching it to the Shamayim, you're attaching it to coming from up in the heavens. And when they were on survival mode and they were out in war, that was when there was no creativity and no time for the new things that could be created in halacha. In order to really see this, besides for this one source to what is talking about asking questions, we see a very, very interesting approach to asking questions and to how things are supposed to be taught from Moshe and Yitro. Okay, so going down a little bit to all the way past just to the psukim in Shemot. And there we have a very interesting story, okay, of when Yitro comes, Moshe's father-in-law comes to visit, and he sees that Moshe is from the morning to very late evening, is sitting there all by himself to ask any questions that Am Yisrael have, and to answer anything and everything. And Yitro sees this and he cannot believe that he is trying to answer all these questions of hundreds of thousands of people, maybe 2 million people that were there. And assuming that everybody has questions every day, but still that was just, he could possibly, do this by himself. And Yitro says to him, listen, what are you doing? And Moshe answers him, and then Yitro is like, this is not sustainable. You have to be able to give this over to other people and to teach them the laws, and then they can teach this. And then of course the obvious question, which is what Abarbanel asks, is what was Moshe thinking actually? Who can possibly think that they can do this on their own? And why wouldn't he give it off to other people to begin with? So if we read the psukim inside, we can see maybe what the different approaches were. Vayhini mahorat, meaning the first day Moshe was greeting Yitro, and the next day it says, Vayeshev Moshe lishpot et ha'am. Moshe is sitting there to judge the nation. Vayamot ha'am al Moshe min haboker ad ha'erev, and the entire nation is standing there from the morning to the evening. Vayar choten Moshe et kol asher hu oseh la'am, and Moshe's father-in-law sees what's going on and what he's doing to the nation. Vayomer meh hadavar hazeh asher ata oseh la'am. What are you doing to this nation? Why are you sitting here all by yourself? Everybody's standing here from the morning to the night. So this is Moshe's answer, is actually giving us an idea of what Moshe was thinking. Okay, I'm in Pasuk Tet Vav, and he says, when the nation comes to ask to seek out God, Ki yelem davar, because they have a thing, meaning they have this need, they have something that came up, they're interested, they want to. Ba'ilai, they come with this thing that's bothering them. It might be, a question, a philosophical question, it might be an actual idea, it might be a case, but they're coming to ask. V'shafatati, and then I judge between ish v're'eu, v'odati et chukei Elokim ve'et toratav. Meaning not only do I judge that specific case, but then I also teach them based on that case. Chukei Elokim v'toratav. I then teach the Hashem's Torah and commandments based on that case. Vayomer choten Moshe elav, and then the Moshe's father-in-law says, Lo tova davar asher ta oseh. This is not good. Navol tibol, Gam ata, gam ha'am hazeh. You're going to be completely worn out, you and the nation. Asher imcha. Ki kaved mimcha hadavar lo tuchal aseu levadcha. It's too heavy for you. You can't do it by yourself. Atashma b'koli, and now listen to me. What I'm gonna advise you. Yitzcha, v'yelokim b'machan Hashem should be with you. Heya ata le'am mul ha'elokim. Okay, you will be with the nation and present these things before God. And you will give these things before God. But he's halta etem et chukim ve'et torot ve'odat lem et derech yelchu ba ve'et ha'maaseh asher yasun. Meaning you have to give over the Torah beforehand. You have to give them tools before this. Go pick out people who are strong people, prosperous people, God-fearing people, and and honest people, that hate to take bribery. Meaning make courts. And they're the ones who are going to constantly be judging. And they will take all and the biggest things are going to go to you, but the small things will go to them. And it will be easier for you. And he does do that in the end of the day. But because it seems so obvious, a lot of Mefarshim, like Abarbanel above, asked, what was Moshe actually thinking? And if we look at the Psukim carefully, seemingly what Moshe was thinking was, I want them to come ask. I want this to come from them. And we might ask ourselves, so what did Moshe want by them coming? Why does he just give them tools to begin with in order to understand this? Why does he have to hold this whole thing by himself? But it could be that the same reason that we saw in Masechet Tmura, which was what's in a question. Why is Moshe saying to Yoshua, ask me a question? And Yoshua answers and says, I've been here the whole time. I heard everything that you said to everybody. I don't have any questions. And seemingly what Moshe wanted was something new, meaning that's how we create new things, is new creations, new understandings, is by asking questions, because the question is coming from the person themselves, as opposed to what's given over to you. So besides for just the tactic of getting people interested, right? I wish I could have a lot more questions here. But when you're just giving off information, it can get a little boring, but and either the person's listening or they're not. But when someone actually comes to you with a question, it means that they actually have this question and they're interested in it and they want to hear the answer. But more than that, when they're coming to you with a question, it also means that part of this is from them. And this sort of connects that new idea that somebody's asking the question and also the answer coming from Shamayim. And it puts the two things together, both the new and the old, meaning it's not just what was, because if it were just what was, Moshe could give it off before. Meaning if this had nothing to do with what the nation was asking, then it really didn't make any sense. Why couldn't Moshe just give over the Torah before, give the tools to whoever it was, the most wise men there, and they'll give it over to the nation. You don't need one person to do this, unless what Moshe was saying is, this is how we create new laws, is that they come up with a new davar, they come up with a new thing, a new question, something else that happened that was, happened in the world. And then I teach them the Torah. Because when you come up with something new, and then we teach them the Torah, that's how we create and we put together the old and the new together. And that essentially seems to be the tactic of bringing over this whole thing to the next generation. So when we go back for a minute, we'll go to the very, very first page, and we're going to take a glance at the actual questions, both in the Yerushalmi and in the Mechilta. But before we do, just the idea of the children or who's ever at the table asking the question, seemingly is when you have this this idea of creating something new and also binding it to something old, which of course is all about bringing this into the next generation and building the next generation of Am Yisrael, which is not just giving over. This is really building. Building is creating. Building is taking something new. Building means that every person coming to ask, and we're going to glance for a few minutes at the different children or people sitting at the table they're all coming with who they are as a person, and they all have what to bring to the table. And again, like it said before, it doesn't have to be your child. It could be your child. It could be your wife, your spouse. It could be shnei chachamim, just people who are wise people sitting around the table. And it might even be all by yourself. And even when it's all by yourself, you're supposed to ask the question instead of just giving over the story. Because if you're just giving over the story again and again, you're just telling something that already was. But if you're asking new questions, you're coming up with new ideas. And the new ideas, at the same time as saving what was, is how we build the new nation of Am Yisrael, which I think is so much part of what, of course, halacha is about, which is so enrooted and so much, from Shamayim in the way that you can't make anything new. Just like it said in Masechet Tzmura, the Nevi'im, even the prophets that are coming from Torah Hashem, they can't make up their own new things. On the other hand, Lo B'Shamayim, on the other hand, it's not just in the heavens. It's really connecting those two things. So let's look for 1 second at some of the questions that are asked. And this would be a little bit easier if we had all the psukim in front of us, but that would be a little bit too much. So we're going to focus right now for what it says in the Yushalmi and in the Mechilta. What we have in front of us, I'm going to start from the second source, which is the Mechilta. That is what we have in our Haggadah in front of us. Okay, Arba banim hem. There are 4 different sons, could be children. Echad chacham, echad rasha, echad tam, v'echad she'no yodea lishon. So simple meaning would be the wise, the wicked, simple, and the one who doesn't know how to ask. And the wise, what does he ask? Ma ha'idut v'chukim v'mishpatim asher tziva Hashem Elokeinu otanu. Okay, what are these edut and chukim and mishpatim? I'm in the second source, meaning in Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael. I'm starting with that before I start the Yerushalmi. And he's asking, what are all these things? And then it says, Afata petachlo, and explain to him, Hilchot Pesach, ein maftirim achar Pesach afikoman. Give him some of the, Hilchot of Pesach, and tell him, ein maftirim achar Pesach afikoman. Nothing after dessert. Dessert's a korban Pesach, and that's it. Okay? Seemingly that very much lines up with the psukim that talk about it. When it says, when it talks about your son asking you, so it mentions that a number of times in the psukim. One of them being in Dvarim Kav. Okay, don't go anywhere else on this page because it's not here, so you just have to have the psukim in front of you, or I'll just read them out loud. So we'll try to focus on it, but I didn't want to bombard with too many psukim. But anybody who does want to see it inside, so in Dvarim Kaf, okay, but on the page we're still on the Mechilta. Okay, just on the psukim, I'm actually going to read them inside. But we're still on this source. We're in still Mechilta. Okay, so we have. Sorry, it's not Dvarim Kav. It's Dvarim Perek Vav. So it's the 6th chapter. Okay, and there we have Ki yeshalcha bincha marchar. Okay, when your son asks you tomorrow, Lemor ma ha'idut v'chukim v'mishpatim asher tziva Hashem Elokeinu etchem. What are these testimonies and the laws and judgments that Hashem has told you to do? And then tell him, V'amarta lebincha avadim hayinu leparo mitzrayim v'yotzienu Hashem mitzrayim biyad chazaka. And then talk to him all about it and tell him that Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim and he gave us all these signs, and continues on to tell him that. Okay, we have another pasuk that talks about when you're asking the questions, and that in a very, very similar way is in Shmot Yud Gimel. Again, we're still in the same sources here on the sheet, but anybody who wants to jump around in the Chumash can look at Shmot Perek Yud Gimel. And when it's talking about redeeming the first son, and of course talking about the importance of the first son, there it says, in Pasuk Yodalid, V'haya ki yish'alcha bincha machar. Again, your son will ask you tomorrow. Mazot, okay, which in the Mechilta says the simple son, the Tam, who's asking that. Okay, which lines up to the simple son here, that he says Mazot, and you say to him, okay, so in Dvarim, that answer that Hashem took us out of Egypt is to the, what we call this, the wise son, whereas in Shmot, that is to the simple son, okay? And then we have the Rasha, who says, what is this work you're doing, okay? And that lines up to in Shmot Yud Bet, the verse 25. We have Haya, it's actually verse 26. When you come to Eretz Yisrael, Hashem gives it to you, okay, and you'll keep this work, meaning Shamart et avodah hazot, and then it says V'haya ki yamu alechem b'nechem, when your son says to you, Ma ha'avodah hazot lachem. That is the wicked son who's saying, Ma ha'avodah hazot lachem. What is this work that you guys are doing? And then tell him Zebach Pesach and other things that we actually don't actually tell him here in the Haggadah. So we have the wise son who's asking about the Edut and the Chukim Mishpatim. We have the wicked son who's saying, what is this work that you're doing? We have the simple son who's just saying, what is this? And a son who doesn't know how to ask. But possibly on a deeper level, we can see in the Yerushalmi how it, right above the Mechilta, how this explains a little bit more what the questions are and how to understand them. Okay? So Tani Rabbi Chia explains that Keneged Alba Banim Dibra Torah. The Torah was talking about 4 different kinds of sons who are asking. The Chacham, the Rasha, the Tipesh, meaning it wasn't so simple. He was simple in the way that he doesn't understand the depth and wisdom of the Torah, but he's not just ignorant. Like he really doesn't understand well. And one who doesn't even know that there's questions to ask. He doesn't even know how to ask. Okay, so the Chacham asks about the Edut and the Chukim and Mishpatim, like we saw, but we answer him a totally different answer than what we answered him in the Mechilta. And we say to him, B'chozek yad hotzeinu Hashem mitzrayim mibeit avadim. Okay, Hashem took us out with a very strong hand from being slaves in Egypt. The wicked son who asks, Ma ha'avodah zot lachem, what he means is, according to Yerushalmi, is Ma ha'torech she'atem matrichim aleinu b'kol shana v'shana. What is this crazy work that we're doing every year? When does somebody ask that? Not when we're sitting at the table, probably when we're cleaning before Pesach. And meaning, what is this work? What do you mean, what is this work? When you're sitting there, like, you know, some king or prince at the Seder table, that's not when you ask that. It's when you're washing, you know, endless things before Pesach. That's when you're asking, what is this that you guys are forcing us to clean the entire, you know, spring cleaning house for Pesach? That's when you're asking that. And the truth is, that's what lines up in the Psukim. The Chacham, when does he ask the question? Tomorrow. Rashi explains that there's a tomorrow that's actually tomorrow, and there's a tomorrow that's one day. That one day means he's not asking right now. First of all, he's sitting as a chacham, like a talmid chacham. A talmid of a chacham is a student of a wise person who's sitting in the Beit Midrash. That's what Chazal mean when they say a chacham. He's not just a professor. He is sitting in the Beit Midrash. He's coming from within. He sees this as part of him. He's not asking you before all this happens. He's asking you mahal. He's sitting here at the Seder table. He's listening to all this. And when this is all finished, he says, what is all of this? I really want to understand the depth of it. But what already passed? Past all of Pesach, past all the Korban, past all the things you ate. Meaning, you did all the mitzvot, and the next day, the wise son is saying, so let me understand what's going on here. That's what it means from coming from within. It's na'aseh v'nishma. The Chacham son is coming from after doing all of this. He really wants to understand in depth what is it he's doing. The Rasha, when does he ask the question? So according to Chazal, that lines up with Shmot Yud Bet, like we said. in verse 26. V'haya ki yomu lechem b'nechem, and it is that when your sons ask, ma ha'avodah hazot lachem. But if we look, when is Shmot Yud Bet Kaf Vav? When is this pasuk brought? It's before they leave Egypt. Meaning, we were given the laws before we left Egypt. And Shmot Yud Bet, that parak, is filled with the laws of the Korban Pesach before we actually do them. And then only in verse Kafchet, it says, meaning they actually did what Moshe told them. And in verse Kaftet, it says, Vayhi bechatzi halayla. It's in the middle of the night, and Hashem struck all the firstborn. So who's asking what question? The Rasha is not asking after the fact, the opposite. He's asking when he first hears about this, even before he did anything. He's like, what is this? What is this crazy work that we're doing? Because the truth of the matter is, it is a lot of work. The work that we do in order to get to this freedom of Pesach is a lot of work. And when does the Rasha ask the question? When he's totally out of the game. And that's why it says that when we answer him, it says, Kevan shehotzi et atzmo min haklal. What did he take him out of the, what do you mean he took him out of the klal? All he said was, Ma ha'avodah zat lachem. It's true, he said, what is for you guys this work? But he's also asking the question when he's not in it yet. Nobody's in it yet. This was before the fact. We were just getting the laws. And way before that, he's like, what is this? The Rasha is way out of here. When he is asking this question, he's not asking from within. He's asking from out. When he's asking from out, he's not one of those who's coming into Geula. He's asking at the hardest time, when we're just getting the laws, when it's all Torah, when we're just in the midst of just the waiting, and we're not there yet in the Geula. And that's when he asks the question. He's like, this is ridiculous. What is this crazy work you're doing? And then we say to him, the truth of the matter is, since he totally took himself out, we say to him, you know what? This is the reason why Hashem did it for me. Hashem did this for me. Meaning for this same man, this Rasha, he wouldn't have done. Had that guy been in Egypt, he never would have been worthy of being taken out. Does it mean he wouldn't have been taken out? Does it mean that the Rasha wouldn't have been, taken out with the rest of them? Seemingly, it means that he wouldn't have taken himself out. Meaning, in order for you to be part of this, you actually have to join in, and you have to join in with your 2 feet. You have to jump in. You have to make sure you're there. And once you're there, you can ask all the questions you want. The opposite, the Chacham is so, you embrace his question. And we're so happy with him asking about the Eidut and the Chukim and the Mishpatim. We're not saying to him, listen, just realize this is what we're doing, that's it. The opposite, we really want to go in depth with him. We want him to understand. But he's got to be in. And the Rasha is asking from out. He hasn't even gone in. And if you haven't even come in when you're asking the questions, you're probably never going to get there. Then we have the Tipesh. The Tipesh is what the Mechilta calls the Tam, which is the simple man. And in the Yerushalmi, he's not just simple. He's just like we feel bad for him. And we say he's pretty stupid, meaning he's not the Chacham that he's sitting inside a Beit Midrash. He's also not wicked in the way that he's totally taking himself out. He just doesn't know the right way. And he says, Mazot, what is all of this? Okay? Mazot, the way we answer the question might explain to us what the question actually is. According to the Yerushalmi, what we say to him is what we say according to the Mechilta and the Chacham, but we say to him, Af lamdo. Also, you teach him Hilchot Pesach. She'ein maftirim achar haPesach afikoman. Explain to him that there's no doing any kind of afikoman after the Pesach. What exactly does that mean? So the way we explained to the Mechilta was, don't eat after dessert. But the Yerushalmi explains it a little bit differently. Shelo yeh omed bechavura zu v'nichnas lechavura acheret. Don't stand in this circle, right? Because people, in order to eat the Korban Pesach, were sitting in a chavura. They were sitting in a group, and they were eating it together in a group. And you needed to be part of that group even before Pesach. You had to decide that this is your korban, that this is your sacrifice, that you're part of this. And you had to choose which one you're part of before and not move from there. And when they slaughter the korban Pesach, this is in everybody's name who's part of that group. So you can't go from one group and then nichnas l'chavura acheret, and then look for a different group. The way some people explain the word afik koman, it's from a Greek word. We can even see in the Aramaic that afik, okay, like nafak, is to come out. You can't go out and go into somebody else's party, which is what they did a lot of times. Essentially, was they were in one party and then they had an after party. They took people out of their homes and they went from party to party, and they were sort of going from one thing to another. And what we're saying to the simple guy is, listen, it's true you might not know exactly where you're holding, you might not know exactly where you are. He's not the Rasha, he didn't totally take himself out of the crowd, but he's also not in the Beit Midrash. He's sort of jumping around. He's sort of that guy who's not exactly sure where he wants to stand. So he's in this chavura and he's in that chavura. And what we say to him is this: listen, you can't go from chavura to chavura. If you really want to understand, and you really want to understand what's going on, you got to sit in one group and be part of that group. Don't go from group to group. It's true, every group is having this korban Pesach and they're having all this own thing. But if you're trying to, go from station to station, in the end, you're going to hear nothing. So you got to stick with one, and there you'll get the information, you'll get the inspiration, and you'll understand, and you'll be part of it. And you have to explain to him that he's got to stick in one place. And then there's the she'eino yodeh lish'ol, the one who doesn't even know how to ask. You have to completely open the door for him. P'tach lo tchila. Okay, he doesn't even understand that there is a place to go into, meaning he's just lost in the way that he doesn't even know what to ask. The way the Yerushalmi explains the four people sitting there at the table, and the four people that we're talking to, is how much they're connected already to this night, right? We have the wise person, and the way the chachamim, meaning Chazal, say this chacham is the chacham of the Beit Midrash, the one who's asking tomorrow, and he's saying tomorrow, can you explain to me all these different idud, chukim, and mishpatim? And because he's asking after the fact, because he was 100% there with us during the Seder night, and he was just with us, and then he just wants to understand the depth of all these different things that idud, the chukim, the mishpatim, we say to him, and if we go into what that answer is in Dvarim, okay, from Kaf to Kaf Daled, again, it's not here, but you have to go into the actual psukim. You don't have to look for it on the actual page. But if we go to it in the psukim in Dvarim, they all line up to, some of them line up to connect Aramaic afik, naf nashosh nafach. Okay, interesting. Thank you. Okay. I'm not sure if the name was Greek or the Aramaic, but either way, we might be talking about an after party, which definitely is the way that Yerushalmi understands going the chavura to chavura. If we look at what the Torah is saying in Sefer Dvarim, and it lines up the edut, the chukim, and mishpatim, three different understandings of what these testimonies are and what the different laws are, and it gives you essentially an answer to each one. And the Yerushalmi obviously makes it much more concise, sort of ... But by bringing us the answer to the Chacham, it's basically throwing us to Dvarim, Perek Vav, right? The 6th Perek in Dvarim, and there we have many psukim that are telling us how we're supposed to engage with this Chacham when he asks that question. Whereas the Rasha, seemingly is because it's not just a matter of what he's asking, it's also when he's asking. It's where he's asking from. The fact that he's asking this right away, and the right away is before we even left Egypt, is that he's taking himself out and he's sort of looking from the outside and saying, what is all of this? Again, before Pesach, and then you'll never get to the Geula. If in the time of the hardships, which is before the Pesach, you're asking yourself, what is all this work? Then you'll never actually get there for the end Geula that's coming after the work and the redemption. The simple one, meaning the one who's not totally in the Beit Midrash but didn't totally take himself out, we just try to ground him, and we say to him, listen, find yourself one group, and there stick to that group and stay grounded there, and from there you can grow. And the last one, we sort of open the door to bring him in, so he even realizes that there's this thing going on. Just to wrap up what we said, the most central idea that we have in Pesach, besides for so much of what's going on, is really how do we give this off to the next generation? How do we educate? How do we all become educators at the table? So much so is that we're not just talking to our kids, but we're even talking to ourselves. How do we educate ourselves? How do we educate other wise people at the table? It could be our spouses, it could be guests, it could be children, it could be ourselves. Again, anybody there, how do we actually do this? And we're holding on to two things. One is we're holding on to the very, very deep roots of the Shamayim, and we're not letting go of where this all came from, but we're asking new questions to make this something new that's also coming from us. And every new person who asks is coming up with something creative and something new that wasn't there beforehand. And we're holding on to those two things. And the time of the creating Am Yisrael and this new nation is when we're holding on to what halacha is all about, which is being enrooted and also blossoming and growing. A good time to mention about Nisan and how we just started Nisan, and we can make Birkat HaIlanot, a special bracha that we make just in Nisan. And it's so related to those trees that are enrooted deep into the ground, but also blossoming new trees, new fruits, new flowers all the time. And that's what's going on here, is that as long as we're jumping in with 2 feet and we're totally committed, then when the questions are what's creating everything new and causing our halacha to constantly be in movement, and coming from each person who's asking those questions is really bringing themselves inside it, which is bringing a whole new world into halacha and into Judaism that wasn't there beforehand. And on the other hand, it's totally enrooted in roots that already were there. Again, it's not, it's not something that a prophet's coming up with totally new. It wasn't enrooted and grounded beforehand. And we're holding on to both of those things as we're asking the questions. And if we look at Yitro and Moshe and how this was laid out, it's sure that's not sustainable for all the time, meaning you just need sometimes the things to be brought to you without the questions. But we have one time a year when we do everything possible to cause the blossoming again of Nisan and the new flowers that are coming from each individual, and encourage people to ask questions as much as possible. So I hope you guys at your seder get as much questions as possible. And again, it doesn't have to come from your kids. It can, it might not. It doesn't have to come from your spouse. It can come from you. So as we're all trying to navigate and prepare for Pesach, don't forget to prepare also a lot of new questions and new thoughts that you can think of every single year. It was a pleasure. And soon we're going to have Rav Sperling on for the halacha survey. So like we said, we encourage all the questions. Please take all of your halacha questions out and feel free to ask Rav Sperling, who will be here to answer all of our halachic practical questions. So unlike Yehoshua, we can't say that we were constantly, here with Moshe all the time. So we all probably have a bunch of kitchen questions to ask. All right, we'll see you soon.
Shalom uvracha. Thank you so much for joining us on the Nishmat Pesach Yom Iyun. It's a real pleasure having you here. And we're going to be spending our time now for the next 50 minutes or so answering Pesach questions. And I'm open here for you to write the questions in chat. I've got some questions that were sent in before that we're going to start. But as the night goes on, in the next 50 minutes or so, I'd be very happy to receive your questions and see if I can answer them. So here we are. I'm Rav Sperling, sitting you from Nishmat in Yerushalayim. It's a pleasure to be here. All right, let's look at the first question that was sent in. The first question that I got was, is there a specific halacha as to how long my Seder should be? Great question. I don't know about in your community, in my community, people tend to spend the next day or two after Pesach saying, oh, my Seder went on till midnight. Oh, midnight, that's nothing. We went to 1. Oh, we've been till 3 in the morning. As if it's some competition that you can win by giving the largest number of how late your Seder went. So let's talk a little bit about the times for Seder night and see if there's a halacha of how long the Seder should be. So first of all, there's a starting time. You cannot start the Seder. That is, you can't pick up the cup and start with Kiddush until 3 stars have come out. That is, until it's nighttime. So even though many of us in summer, especially in places where it's summertime, you live where it doesn't get dark till very late, you're used to bringing Shabbos in early, you can't bring Seder night in early. You must do Kiddush when it's dark. So that's a beginning time. Next, we have a middle time. There's a time period called Chatzot. Chatzot means midnight. It's not exactly 12 o'clock on our watches, but exactly half the evening between when the sun goes down to the sun rises, or 3 stars until first light. It's exactly in Jerusalem this year with summertime. That is at 12:39. And you can find that on all good Jewish calendars. If you type onto the computer, My Zmanim or some site like that, it should tell you when halachic midnight chatzot is. And the Shulchan Aruch says that ideally a person should finish saying Hallel by halachic midnight. Ideally, you should finish saying Hallel by halachic midnight. Many people don't make to the end of Hallel, that is, to the end of the 4th cup by 12:39 in Jerusalem this year. Some people are just careful to make sure they get to Afikomen by midnight, 12:39 by Chatzot. And if you get to Afikomen by Chatzot, you're also doing great. And there are many opinions that say you don't have to worry so much about Hallel, but you should worry about Afikomen. And then there are opinions that say you don't even have to worry about Afikomen so much as long as you got to the beginning of the meal, that is the blessings on matzah and maror before halachic midnight. So let's summarize this middle time. We should try, how late can your Seder go? Well, you should try, if you can, without a lot of pressure, and it's okay. Some people try to finish Hallel by Chatzot. But others say it's enough to get to Afikomen by Chatzot. And some people say that it's even enough if you just reach the beginning of the meal by Chatzot. When do you end? Well, the Haggadah just tells about those rabbis in Bnei Brak who went until morning, because the halacha is that even after you've finished Hallel and drunk the 4th cup and said the Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, and maybe sang Haggadah if you do those songs at the end, then it's good to sit and learn and study and talk about the Exodus from Egypt until sleep overcomes you. So many people at the end of the Seder will stay learning and talking about the Pesach until they're so tired they just need to go to sleep. There are righteous people who certainly stay up all night, but you don't have to do that. So let's summarize the answer. How long should your Seder be? Well, it should be long enough that people feel excited for the whole time, that people don't get exhausted, the people who are involved, that you have what to say. That is, there's no great mitzvah to schlep it out. On the other hand, if you've got more to say and you've got energy, you've got excitement, if you have more tunes to sing, if you have more praise to give to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then that's wonderful. Keep the midnight for your halachic considerations in mind and go with your heart. Yofi. So that was the first question that we said. What was the time for ending the Seder? Okay, I'm looking now at a question that's just been sent in. Oh. So we have a question that's been sent in. I've heard that baker's yeast is not chametz, but I recently heard that nutritional brewer's yeast is chametz. It's a bit expensive, can be hard to find. I have about half a bag, 18 shekels worth. Is it better to sell it or to throw it out? Great question. So that gives me an opportunity to answer about selling and destroying all our chametz. So we all know that before Pesach, you can't go into Pesach with chametz. You have to get rid of your chametz. The classic way to get rid of your chametz is actually to eat it, use it all up. And what's left to burn before Pesach, to get rid of and to burn in the morning before Pesach. That's called bi'ur chametz, and that's a mitzvah. And a person shouldn't worry that they're doing bal tashchit, that they're destroying food, because the Torah tells us that if you have food left over on the morning of Erev Pesach, that there's a mitzvah to burn it. So if you're doing a mitzvah, that's not considered as wasting anything. Throughout Jewish history, there have been times when we've sold our chametz. The sale of chametz is very ancient. There's sources from it already mentioned in Chazal of rabbis who were on a ship, on a boat, and they were traveling for many weeks, and Pesach was somewhere in there, and they needed food for after Passover. So they sold all their food to a non-Jew on the boat with the implicit understanding, without ever being said, but an implicit understanding that, please God, they would buy it back afterwards and buy it back from the non-Jew afterwards. Throughout Jewish history, Jews used this when they were in the alcohol business, and they bought and sold real chametz. Rav Feinstein says the essence of the sale is to sell real chametz. And there are many good kosher Jewish families who sell real chametz. Certainly you'll find lots of families who sell whiskey. And if you have a lot of chametz and it's a monetary loss, people for sure sell real chametz. And if that is your custom, you can sell real chametz. It's a real sale. You need to speak to your rabbi or go online and sell your chametz. However, my rabbi and teacher Rav Henken Zatzal, he didn't like the idea of selling real chametz if there's no need. So if you have a supermarket or you have hundreds of shekels worth of alcoholic whiskeys and things that are chametz, then for sure you need to sell them. You don't have to take a huge monetary loss and go out of business because of Pesach. However, if you have 18 shekels worth of chametz, then it's probably better to get rid of it and buy a new one afterwards. Unless it's really hard to find and you have a specific dietary need and you're worried that you won't be able to fulfill your dietary needs after Pesach, that might be a reason to rely on the opinions to sell real chametz. But if we're just talking about 18 shekels worth, most people could say that it's worth Pesach, 18 shekels worth. Make a cake for this Shabbos, use up your yeast, and the rest get rid of before Pesach. Okay. Next question that's been sent in. If you come from Chutz La'aretz before Bidika in Israel, should you do Bidika in your hotel room? Depends when you check in. If you check in on the morning before Passover, that is, in Israel, Passover, or everywhere in the world, Passover this year is going to be on a Friday night. If you check in on Friday morning, then, if it's a Jewish hotel with a heksher, then you can assume that the hotel has done B'dikat Chametz for you. But if you check, you can ask them always, but the answer will be, yes, the room's clean for Pesach, there's no Chametz there. If you check in on Thursday or before that, then you have to do B'dikat Chametz in your room because you've rented the room and you're allowed to eat there. And in fact, people do eat in the hotel rooms. and therefore you should do Bidikat Chametz with a blessing in your hotel room, because you are renting a hotel room and you've rented it before the beginning of Passover, before Bidikat Chametz night, before Thursday night, and you should do Bidikat Chametz there with a bracha. Okay. Next question. Please feel free to send in your questions and answers. I'm going to go to the next question that I've got here, which is, by the way, I understood from that question that if someone's coming to Eretz Yisrael for Pesach and doing a B'dika in the hotel room makes me very happy, and seems to imply that you're coming to Israel for Pesach. And that's a wonderful, wonderful thing to do. That's wonderful. We look forward to seeing you here. Okay. Is there something equivalent to Bitul B'shishim rule with Kashrut in Chametz? Great question. Is there a concept of nullification in connection with Chametz? So we know, for example, milk and meat, that if you're drinking your coffee, your milky coffee while you're making the chicken soup, and by accident someone pushes your arm and a drop falls in of the milk into the chicken soup, everyone knows the rule. If there is 60 times more soup than the milk that fell in, the milk is nullified, 1 in 60, bitul b'shishim, and the milk is kosher. Of course, you can't pour it in, the milk, even a few drops, but if it by accident it fell in, then you're great. Does that work for Pesach? So the answer is no. If during Pesach, even the tiniest bit of chametz fill into your food, it's not nullified. Even 1 in 1,000, even 1 in 10,000, it's not nullified. Mashu shel chametz is asur on Pesach. However, if it was nullified by accident before Pesach, then there is a concept that it's nullified. There's a bit of an argument about whether on Passover it comes back to life or not. But in general, if something was nullified before Passover, then it stays nullified during Passover. Because of this, there are some people who are careful to buy their milk or things like that before Passover, because it's possible that in the big milk companies, maybe a tiny bit of chametz fell in, or maybe there's some scientific additive in the milk that was added into the milk without our knowledge. And then because the milk was made before Passover, it would be nullified. And that's why sometimes you'll see on a good heksher, it will say kosher for Pesach from before Passover. And what they mean to tell you is that it has the extra stringency that even if there was a tiny bit of chametz, we hope there wasn't, but if there was, it would have been nullified. In a simple answer, if during Passover, even the tiniest bit of chametz fell into your food, stop right there and call your rabbi up. If before Passover, a tiny bit of chametz fell into your food, then yes, there's normal nullification that applies, but it'd be good to ask your rabbi in each case. Okay, I've got another question here, which is if you don't eat gebroks, doesn't mean you can't put anything on matzah, or there are some foods that don't count as putting liquid on matzah. Okay, so let me explain. Some Jews have a custom of not eating a thing called gebroks. In Hebrew, that's a Yiddish word, gebroks. In Hebrew, the word is shuria. And the custom, mainly found amongst Hasidic Ashkenazi Jews, is not to eat any matzah or matzah product, matzah meal, matzah flour, not to eat any matzah product that comes into contact with liquid during Passover. So they don't have matzah ball soup. Hard to believe, huh? But there are Jews who do that. What's their worry? Their worry is that perhaps inside the matzah, there might have been one little place that wasn't properly baked. And so there'll be a 1 grain of uncooked flour. And if that grain of uncooked flour comes into contact with water, with liquid, it will become chametz. Woo. And therefore, we don't want that on Passover. So they don't wet their matzahs at all. If truth be told, the way we make matzahs today, which are very thin and crispy, the doubts about this being problematic are really slight. And therefore, unless you come from a community or a family that has such a concept, who has such a custom, you should not take this on. It's not normally halacha, the mainstream halacha, says that a person doesn't have to worry about this at all. And it's not the type of stringency that you should take upon yourself unless it's a community custom. It's really only if it's part of your family community. Now, if it is your custom, then different communities have different ways of applying that custom. Some of them are very strict and they won't put anything on their matzahs, nothing. They won't put butter, they won't put anything, they won't put nothing on it. Others are more lenient and they will get their matzahs wet as long as it's not with anything that has water in it. And some of them say you can get it wet as long as you eat it within 18 minutes. So to answer your question, if you keep geboks, if you keep shuria, are you allowed to wet your matzah at all or put anything on your matzah? So the answer is you have to find your community custom. So you should find out why you keep that custom, which community it is. For example, Chabad Hasidim keep that. And then you should speak to your Chabad rabbi and ask him, in what way do Chabad rabbis keep that? Great. Let's look. Next question I get here. Are raw grains, barley, rye, flour, oats, considered chametz gamur? The reason someone's asking this question, whether raw grains are considered chametz gamur, is because, like we spoke about, some people sell real chametz, but some people don't sell real chametz. And if you don't sell real chametz, what should you do with these grains? So if they're real chametz, if the grains are considered chametz, then you have to get rid of them. But if the grains, dry grains, are not considered chametz, then you don't have to get rid of them. So that's the reason they're asking the question. Now, the simple answer is that raw grains, rye, barley, oats, spelt, are not chametz. We actually use them to make matzah. We make matzah out of wheat. However, it could be that the grains that you have, especially if they've been made into flour, then they might have been cleaned in water. They might have been processed and cleaned on a conveyor belt that goes through water to get rid of the outer husk or to bleach them or to make them clean, in which case they might really be chametz already. So in answer to your question is, yes, there's a real possibility that raw grains are chametz gamur. It's not always that. It depends on how they were processed to get them to you. But that's the doubt. So the answer is, if you know that they were pure, raw, dry grains that have never been wet, then for sure you can keep them. However, if you don't know, and they've been made into flour, certainly, once they've been made into flour, then there's a big doubt, and it could be that they're real chametz, and you should act appropriately. Okay, next question I see here. Hello, Rabbi. I live in Poland, and I welcome 2 Ukrainian refugee families with lots of children into my house. I have a big halachic problem with Passover. I know that it will be impossible to stop them from eating chametz. Children are small, and they struggle with money too. I thought of moving out for Pesach. What's the best solution for a problem like this? So the first thing you should certainly do is speak to your local rabbi who understands the situation there. Second, you should get advice from someone on site. The second thing is that it depends if they're Jewish or not Jewish. If the Ukrainian refugees are not Jewish, there's much less of a problem. There's still a problem, but there's less of a problem because a non-Jew is allowed to eat chametz. There's a problem with them bringing into a Jewish house, but there might be a way that you could rent them out a room or give them a room for Passover and make it their room, and you won't use that room, and that'll be their place for Passover. If they're Jewish, then you've got a much bigger problem, and I'd like you to speak to a rabbi in Poland who'll be able to give you advice about what to do right there. Okay. Let's see if we have some other questions here. One moment. Okay. If you did a bedika in your hotel room, do you need to use bread pieces? And then what do you do the bread? And can you just do bedika with a bracha without anything? Great question. So we said that yes, you can do a bedika in your hotel room, and you should do a bedika in your hotel. So now the question is, do you have to hide 10 pieces of bread? So the answer is no. There's a custom to hide 10 pieces of bread, but if it's hard for you, if it means you're going to have to go out, you just come to Israel, you didn't bring any chametz, you have to go out and find a shop that's still selling chametz and take it into your room and then get it. And then in the morning, how are you going to get rid of it? You're going to go downstairs, you're going to walk around the neighborhood and try and find someone who's burning chametz. If you can't, you're going to have to throw it into a public garbage bin, or you can flush it down the toilet. But in a technical answer to your question is, I would do b'dikat chametz with a bracha, but without placing the 10 pieces of chametz around to sek. And you still need to check, lift up the mattress in the hotel room, look under the bed, open the drawers, certainly check the hotel fridge. Maybe they put free drinks in there that might be chametz, in which case you have to call the hotel and ask them to take it out. So yes, you could do a bedika without putting the 10 pieces. You should turn on the flashlight on your cell phone so that you can do it with a light, say a bracha before and say kol chamira afterwards. Okay. Next question. When kashering the kitchen before Passover, how long do I need not to use chametz in the sink, stove, and oven? And how long do I need not to use chametz in pots and pans and utensils before doing hagala? Okay, so it depends on how you're going to kosher the objects. In general, we try not to use items that we're about to kosher with chametz for 24 hours before koshering them. That's for hot use, above yatzola bowl, too hot to touch. So you can certainly use your sink and wash your hands in it and have a cup of water and even clean the vegetables in the sink and then immediately afterwards kosher it. But if you're going to pour hot noodles into it, you should try and have a 24-hour gap between the last hot use of chametz and koshering your kitchen. This is true, especially for things you're doing with hagala. If you're using a blowtorch or something like to clean an oven, there's less of a need. But when you're using, but even then, it's good to wait 24 hours. After waiting 24 hours, the level of taste absorbed in an item goes down to only a rabbinic level, and it's much safer koshering them like that. So you should try to have 24 hours between koshering your microwave, between the last use of the microwave, the use of the microwave is hot, using the oven, you should try and have a 24-hour wait between using it and koshering it. Okay. What about food which contains some minor quantity of wheat of a doubtful ingredient, such as glucose, which could be from grain or something else? Is it better to sell or throw? So it depends. If your custom is to sell real chametz, then you've got no problem. You could sell that too. If your custom is not to sell real chametz, then you should look on one of the lists. The OU provides a wonderful list of things that are real chametz and things that aren't. You can type online lists of chametz gamor, and you'll see which things are and which things aren't. Okay. There's a question here. What is, I don't quite see the question. It's asking about which is better, hand matzah or machine matzah. That's a very interesting question. First of all, the main question is only for the mitzvah of eating matzah on Seder night. For the rest of Pesach, really, most people hold that there's not much difference for the rest of Passover. There are people who are strict and only eat hand matzahs for all of Passover. But the rabbinic consensus is that for the rest of Passover, apart from the matzot you eat on Seder night, everything is good. So let's talk about the matzot we eat on Seder night. There's a machloket. When we left Egypt, we used handmade matzahs. Right? That was clear. We had no machine matzahs. However, already from more than 100 years now, they've got machines that make matzahs. There are two halachic questions, at least, to do with the machines. One question is, can you really get them kosher for Pesach? After you've done the first batch, maybe there are bits of dough that still sit inside the machine. And then that dough will rise and it'll fall into the second batch. And then everything except for the first batch might have a question of chametz in it. Today, that's much less of a problem. And they make the machines out of stainless steel, and they have high pressured air that blows through them and gets rid of every speck every 18 minutes and cleans them incredibly. And therefore, we don't really have to worry about whether the matzahs are kosher from the machine or not. In fact, between you and me, it could be that the machine matzahs are either more kosher. As someone who's made matzahs many years, human beings make mistakes. And sometimes in your machine matzahs, you make mistakes. And there's a chance that they blew it, and they didn't do them quick enough. So for the question of kashrut, many rabbis say that machine matzahs are at least as kosher, or maybe even more kosher than the hand matzahs. However, there's another problem, and that is that the matzah you eat on Seder night has to be made with the intention that it's mitzvah matzah. And if you've ever baked matzah, it's great. You hear everyone saying, for the sake of mitzvah matzah, these matzahs are being made for the sake of mitzvah matzah, in order to put intent into the matzahs we're making. So there's a big halakhic question whether by saying for the sake of mitzvah matzah and pushing a button and starting a machine, that works. The machines don't have intent. Is it enough that the person turning the machine on has intent? Well, I don't know. So that's a machloket. The rabbis on both sides of the argument, and a person certainly who holds one side or the other side as great rabbis on who to rely upon. My community, the many students of Rav Kook, particularly use machine matzahs, because Rav Kook felt that it was better to use machine matzahs. He felt there was no problem of intent, and he felt that they were made more quickly and there were less problems of kashrut. But I know the reality in most of the Orthodox world says that handmade matzahs are better because you can put more intent into the matzahs. And therefore, many Orthodox Jews used handmade matzahs for the matzahs they're going to eat for the mitzvah on Seder night. Bottom line, you can do what you always do. It's going to be okay. Okay, next question. I'm not sure if the counters in my apartment are real shaish or even kisar. How do you go about koshering them for Passover? Okay, so in Israel, the sideboards are made out of marble, or something that looks like marble. We call it shaish, which is the Hebrew word for marble. Some of them are real marble and some of them are fake marble. And the question is, how do we kosher them? So there are difference of opinions about this. What I'm telling you now is mainstream. If it's fake marble, there's actually a question of how to kosher it. But that's not such a big problem as people might think, because I doubt very much whether you're going to start a fire underneath the marble countertop and cook your eggs on the countertop. We're not actually going to cook on the countertop. At the very worst, a piece of schnitzel is going to fall onto the countertop hot and we're going to lift it off. But we're not going to cook on the countertop. Therefore, the ways to kosher them are less than how you would kosher a vessel, a pot that was made out of stone or pseudo stone. The major way people kosher them today is cleaning them really well and then pouring boiling water over them. Some people say that when you pour the water out of the kettle, it cools down a bit and therefore you should have a boiling hot piece of stone and pour over it that will heat the water up again. You can it's pretty tricky to do that today. You can solve that problem by actually pouring out of a kettle that's still plugged in, like your Shabbos urn, on an extension cord, and then you're actually pouring from the water while it's still on the fire. However, bottom line, because the only food you're ever going to eat that falls onto the countertop also came out of a pot that's not on the fire, therefore, most rabbis say it's enough to take the kettle that's boiling hot and pour it all over the sideboard. Some people say that you should cover the sideboard, and in Israel they sell heavy duty foil to cover it, and then you can make your kitchen look like a spaceship and you'd be very religious. I decided that it's much easier just to go and buy some of those rolls of hard duty plastic tablecloths that they sell in Israel by the meter. And I bought 3 or 4 meters and cut to size and used the same one every year, made a hole for the sink, no problem. And some rabbis say you should pour hot water, dry it, and then cover it. So either of them are good. Boiling water from the kettle, or boiling water from a kettle that's still plugged in, or covering, or doing both. And they're all fine. Okay, if you marry someone who is less strict than you with the foods they eat on Passover, is it okay to take on their custom? Oh, big question. So first of all, we're talking about 2 people who both are keeping halacha, right? There's obviously no question if you marry someone who eats bread on Passover, no, you can't take on their custom, and I hope they'll take on yours. But if we have 2 people who have different customs, maybe one of them is Sephardi and one of them is Ashkenazi. One eats rice and one doesn't eat rice. Even in the Sephardi world, some Sephardim eat rice and some Sephardim don't eat rice. Baruch Hashem, there are customs on Passover. So there are many opinions about what to do about this. Some rabbis say, no, everyone has to keep their own customs and you just have to make do. Most rabbis said it's not good, that you should try and have a unified custom. Rav Moshe Feinstein writes that it's better that the wife takes on the customs of the husband. Our rabbi and teacher Rav Henkins Zatzal was not so sure about that, and he brought proofs that maybe the husband could take on the customs of the wife. Practically, he said they should try and figure these questions out without fights and not having to resort to halachic rules. There's usually other factors involved, like which country they live in, where they're going for Seder, what guests they're having, how they want to bring their children up. There's usually other factors involved. So the bottom line answer is yes, if a couple gets married, there is room for one of them to take on the customs of the other one. Who takes on which customs, you should either figure it out together or take advice from your local rabbi to figure out which side should take on which customs and try and have a unified kitchen on Passover. Do you need to change your toothbrush and toothpaste for Passover? Great question. Let's start with toothpaste. Toothpaste is not food and it's not even edible. And theoretically, toothpaste doesn't need a heksha. However, my rabbi, my Rosh Hashiva, Rav Shlomo Aviner Shlita, he explained to me one time that toothpaste is so tasty today and comes in such beautiful mint flavors. He said that if it wasn't sold as toothpaste, you could probably sell it as a spread to put on your sandwiches. And he might have been exaggerating a little bit. So he said there are people who like eating toothpaste, and he said you should look for a heksha for toothpaste. And I think also in Israel or in a country where it's easy to get toothpaste that's kosher for Pesach, you take your old one, you sell it with all the vessels that you're selling, with everything you're selling for Passover, and your toothpaste lasts a long time. It's not going to be, you were halfway through the old one, you didn't have to throw it away, you just sold it. So it'll take you now an extra bottle before you have to buy another one. You won't lose out. So it's good to buy toothpaste with a heksha. But if you live in a place where you can't get a heksha for toothpaste, standard normal toothpaste doesn't actually, from the letter of the law, need a heksha for Pesach, and it because it's not a food, it's not edible. It's good to get a new toothbrush for Passover because our toothbrushes might have been used and got a little bit of chametz on them. But from the letter of the law, the answer is that also doesn't need, because we only use our toothbrushes cold. And when we use things cold, right, no one uses it hot. You never put boiling water in your mouth and brush your teeth with it. And therefore, it just needs to be washed out before Passover. However, the general custom, the practice amongst Orthodox Jews is to get a new toothbrush for Shabbat, for Passover. But from the letter of the law, no, it's enough just to wash it. The reason we get a new one is because when you're koshering the fridge, that little piece of the one on the door that makes the vacuum, that accordion piece of rubber that closes the fridge, that's designed to catch sesame seeds and small crumbs of chametz, and it's almost impossible to get them out of the fridge door. So it's really good to use a toothbrush for that. It works wonderfully and it doesn't rip the rubber. And then you can buy a new toothbrush for Passover. All right, next question. What about an item that a person takes for medical purposes, specifically 2 teaspoons of a probiotic that is put into water? I think it has dextrin in it. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to admit, I do not know all the details of these medicines. I'm going to say like this. Any medicine that is swallowed in a tablet form does not need a heksher for Passover. If it is sucked or taken in a liquid form, then you need to find if it's got a heksher for Pesach. In Israel, there's a hotline from the Kupat Cholim to call up and ask. And in America, the OU has a service like that, I'm almost sure, where you can write the name of your medicine and they'll tell you whether you can have it on Passover or not. And if not, they'll tell you what to do. Certainly, everyone should know that in the case of life-threatening situations, a person can either eat chametz to save their life on Passover. We hope that no one gets to such a situation. But if a person's in danger, a person who's sick and they take medicine for chronic illness, then for sure they should consult a kashrut authority and find out what they should do before Passover, before stopping taking a medicine. Let's just summarize. Any tablets that a person takes that aren't designed to suck with a good taste, but they're designed just to swallow, any tablets do not need a heksher for Passover. They make a list. People like to be strict, but they don't need other thing. Anything that is has a nice taste, like you suck on it, or it's a liquid that you drink, then you should look for a heksher and you should discuss it with the kashrut authorities to understand about each medicine and have lists in front of them. Great. We're going to Israel for Passover. Mazel tov. We're sending our dog to a non-Jewish farm. Abi has a nice festival too. If we need to send food with the dog and give it to the farm to keep for themselves and for other dogs as well, must the food be Pesach? If we place uses of their food we feed our dog, must we insist their food is Pesach? Okay, so your dog is not Jewish. Let's start like that. A person has a pet dog. Let's just get it out of the way first. Pets, dogs, animals are not Jewish. Yeah, they don't need a bar mitzvah. No questions of intermarriage. Animals are not Jewish. However, your pets have to keep kosher for Passover. Why? Because the Torah tells us that we're not allowed to benefit from chametz. And because you have an obligation to feed your dog, if you feed your dog chametz, even if you didn't owe that chametz, if you feed your dog chametz, you are saving yourself the money that it would have cost you to feed your dog dinner. And therefore, you just benefit from chametz. You saved yourself the price of giving him a steak for dinner by giving him a loaf of bread. And by doing that, you have you have a problem. Therefore, it would be wise to do one of two things. Either to give your dog, to give the people who are going to feed your dog kosher for Passover dog food, to feed the dog during the days of the festival. Alternatively, there is a way that you could, like you sell chametz, you could sell your dog to the non-Jewish farm, and then the dog would be theirs, and then they could feed the dog whatever they wanted. You would have to speak to a rabbi on location about whether he could assist you in figuring out how to sell your dog to the farm, and then the would not be a problem. But if you're not going to do that, then yes, the dog should eat kosher to Passover food. Okay, do vitamins need to have a heksher for Passover? Specific prenatal vitamins. We generally say that vitamins are not really a medicine, and therefore it's good that we should look for a heksher on them. If you're in Israel, they have a long list. It's online, and all the Kupat Cholim have a list of many prenatal vitamins that have a heksher for Passover. If you're overseas, if you're in America, I believe the major go. If your doctor has said that you need to take the vitamins because you've got low iron or whatever it is, then if the vitamin tablet doesn't have a good taste, it's in a capsule form or it's in a tablet form that does not have a good taste, then if you need to, there's room to be lenient and take that even if it doesn't have a heksher for Pesach, but you should try and get ones that have a heksher for Pesach. Okay, I have some, can pets eat kidney hot? 100%, even though we said your pets have to keep kosher to Passover, and even though you are Ashkenazi, therefore it's forbidden for you to eat kitniot. However, the Ashkenazim, even though they took upon themselves not to eat kitniot already for these more than 1,000 years, we didn't take upon ourselves that kitniot is chametz. No way. We're allowed to keep kitniot in our house, and I do that myself. Before Passover, we kosher our kitchen a few days before Passover. Kosher on Wednesday, Passover is until Friday night. Of course, then there's no bread in the house, and we have a custom not to eat matzah. So what's left of food? So I buy like those rice cakes that are kosher for Passover, and they're rice cakes, but I always buy too many. And so we've got a whole lot left. I push them to the back of the drawer so I don't make a mistake during Passover, but I keep them during Passover. Not only can I keep them, if I wanted, if my neighbor wanted, I could benefit, I could give them to my neighbor on Passover. I could sell them to my neighbor on Passover. If you're a Jewish shopkeeper, you're allowed to sell kitniot on Passover. I can sell kitniot, I can benefit from kitniot, so I can even feed my animals kitniot. Because kitniot, the Ashkenazim took upon themselves not to eat, but they didn't take upon themselves that it's like chametz, that it's forbidden to benefit. And therefore, either an Ashkenazi can give their pets kitniot. Wow, great. I have another question here. If I travel and leave my apartment for Passover, do I still have to clean it? You're leaving your place for Pesach, you're going off to Kibbutz Lavi up north. Wow, wonderful, great. Or you're leaving your apartment in America and you're coming to Eretz Yisrael for Passover, for Pesach. Wonderful. Do you still have to clean and get rid of your chametz? So the answer is like this, that a person can sell all their chametz, and by selling their chametz, they can get out of doing bidkat chametz. It's actually a halachic argument because the sale doesn't come into effect until the morning, till Friday morning. But we do the bidkat chametz on Thursday night. So there are rabbis who say, because you haven't sold it yet, you still got an obligation to check. But other rabbis, and that seems to be the general practice, say, no, we know you're going to sell it. So what are you going to do? You're going to open the cupboard and say, I found chametz, hi chametz, good, and then close the cupboard again, because you know you're going to sell it tomorrow. So most opinions say that if you know you're going to sell, you don't have to check. There are people who are strict and therefore they'll do an early sale. And if they know they're not going to be home at all, they'll sell not on the morning before Passover, they'll sell the morning before that. And that way, on the night of B'dikat Chametz, it's already not theirs. And then for sure, you don't have an obligation to sell. That's called a sale on the 13th, rather than a sale on the 14th of Nisan. But that's a chumrah. And from the letter of the law, you don't have to do that. So the answer is, a person who is closing up their house and leaving their house during Pesach does not need to do B'dikat Chametz there. Now, let me add a few points about that. Firstly, if you do that, you actually miss out this great mitzvah of doing B'dikat Chametz. So if you know you're going to come to a new location and get to do B'dikat Chametz there, like you're renting a hotel room, or you're moving into a new house or something like that, or you're going to be with your children in Israel, and you're going to help them do B'dikat Chametz and listen to their bracha and help them do B'dikat Chametz, then that's good. But if you're really just leaving your house on the morning of Friday morning and going away for all of Pesach, so you didn't do B'dikat Chametz on Thursday night because you're leaving your house, and you're not going to get to do B'dikat Chametz anywhere, that's kind of upsetting. You're halachically okay, but you missed the mitzvah. Why would you want to do that? Secondly, if you are leaving your house for Pesach and going away, and you're just closing up and selling it, no one can use the house. Someone can go, you forgot your umbrella, it starts raining on Chol Hamoed, and you want to jerk back in and just walk through and take the umbrella out. That you can do. You can walk through, you can walk in, you can walk out, but you can't use it. A person can't sell their whole house and not do B'dikat Chametz, and then let your neighbor put their Passover guests for Seder night to sleep in the house. You can't use the house and sell it too. So that's a second thing, that not only will you miss out the mitzvah, you also have to know that whatever house or room or place you're selling cannot be used on Passover. It can be walked through, can be gone in a time of need. We reserve the right when we sell chametz to go in and out of a place that we sold, but certainly not to sit and use the place. Okay. We have another question here. How can I know if I should keep 2 starim if I live in Israel? Oh, that's great. 1 day or 2 days. Good. Well, it's very clear. The Jews who live in Israel keep 1 day. The Jews who live in Chutz La'aretz keep 2 days, and there's not much you can do about that. That's what the Gemara says, that the Jews in Chutz La'aretz have to keep the 2nd day rabbinically, and you have to keep 2nd day Yom Tov. If you're from Chutz La'aretz and you're coming to Israel, so that's also great. Once you come here, you come to live here forever, and you keep 2 days. Baruch Hashem, my wife and I, 35 years ago, we got off the plane, and even though we kept 2 days our whole life, we became Israeli. That's the simplest thing to do, that everyone who's coming to Israel should determine that they're coming to Israel to stay forever. You should live here and you should do the mitzvah of Aliyah, and then you just keep 1 day, no problem. However, what about people who are coming and they're just visiting? So let's break this up into 2 types of just visiting. There's just visiting for a very short amount of time around the festival, where a person has their house, their job, their car back in Chutz La'aretz, and they're coming to Israel for a week or 2, 3 around the festival to be with the kids, to see the land, to do Passover in Israel. Wonderful. Later, we'll talk about someone who's coming here much longer term. You're coming to study for a year. You're coming to a midrashah. You're coming to spend a year learning in Nishmat, in Yerushalayim. You're taking a year off college to come and learn here. That's wonderful. Let's talk about someone who's coming for a very short time. Someone who's coming for a very short time. The standard halachic opinion is that because you've left your house, your job, your car, your life in Chutz La'aretz, because you know you're going back, because you're here for only a very short amount of time, a few weeks, and you have full intention of returning to Chutz La'aretz, therefore you have to keep 2 days even when you're here. That doesn't cause any fights. The Israeli Jews are very happy. I see them walking through town. They're in hotels that have a 2nd day minyan, and you have to keep 2 days here. You have to keep 2 days at the beginning, 2 days at the end. And an Israeli who's just visiting Chutz La'aretz, they're going there for a week or 2, they're going to run a Seder in somewhere, they're going for just a short amount of time, they have their house and job and everything in Israel. In Chutz La'aretz, they have to keep 1 day. However, here it's tricky. On the 2nd day, they can't do any melacha. They can't do any labor because that'll cause fights. If an Israeli goes to Chutz La'aretz and keeps 1 day, and on the 2nd day Yom Tov, all the Jews are going to shul and keeping Yom Tov and doing 2nd night Seder, and he's going driving around in his car and turning lights on and doing all this stuff, going to the movies, that will cause fights in the Jewish community. So they say that a Jew, if he's gone to visiting a Jewish community in Chutz La'aretz, he keeps 1 day, he davens 1 day, but on the 2nd day, he can't do any malacha, even in private. This is mainstream halacha. That's what the Shulchan Aruch rules, that someone who's visiting Eretz Israel keeps their custom of 2 days. Someone who's visiting from Israel to Chutz La'aretz keeps 1 day, but on the 2nd day, they can't do any malacha, and they kind of have to pretend to be keeping 2nd day so they don't cause any fights. The exact details of that get quite technical, but that's in the general picture. I add that there is an opinion which says it goes where your body is. The Hacham Tzvi says that no, everything I just said, which is the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch, is not true. Why? If your body is in Israel, you keep 1 day. If your body's in Chutz La'aretz, you keep 2 days. There are Jews who follow that opinion. In some Hasidei Chabad and some students of Rav Soloveitchik follow that opinion. If your rabbi rules like that, you can do that. Mainstream Shulchan Aruch and Mishnah Berurah say you do it what I said in the beginning. If you're here for a longer time, you're coming to study for many months, you're coming to volunteer in Israel, you're trying out Israel, you're here for months, then there's much more room to say that you should only keep 1 day. There are many more factors, but there are many opinions about this issue. I would advise you to speak to your local rabbi before deciding. If you're here for a longer period of time, that is certainly a year or a whole semester of study or you're trying out Israel for 6 months and seeing about staying, or anything like that, then there are many rabbis who are more lenient. There are rabbis who are stricter. It's a machloket, and you should speak to your local rabbi about that. If you have a practical question, that's a question I love the most. People are coming to spend time in Israel so that I can give them halachic rulings about keeping 1 day or 2 days. It makes me so happy to hear about Jews coming to visit. And on that note, maybe we'll finish now, and I can personally invite you to come and visit Israel and come into Nishmat and learn some Torah with us. We have a wonderful, wonderful summer program. We have a wonderful year program. We have a Beit Midrash that's constantly open. We have classes for those who can't get here on Zoom throughout the year. And we'd love you to come and learn with us. Shalom uvracha.